The first time I met Cal, he was sitting on top of a freezer in the middle of a gas station, eating a popsicle like he had all the time in the world. It was nearly midnight, and I had only stopped by to grab some late-night road trip snacks, something salty, something sweet, and maybe an energy drink potent enough to power a small city. The gas station was empty except for the cashier, who looked like he was one yawn away from falling asleep, and Cal, perched on the freezer like some kind of bored crow. He was wearing a faded hoodie, ripped jeans, and bright yellow sneakers so obnoxious they practically glowed under the fluorescent lights. I paused, unsure whether to pretend I didn't see him or ask if he worked there. Before I could decide, he turned to me, waved the popsicle in the air like a scepter, and said, "You look like someone who overthinks their snack choices." "Excuse me?" I replied, baffled. "People like you always go for the balanced snack combo," he continued, gesturing dramatically. "Chips, candy, and something caffeinated. Classic road trip trifecta. But it's a trap. You're going to regret it when the sugar crash hits in 2 hours." I stared at him, trying to figure out if he was genuinely trying to help or just messing with me. "And what would you recommend, oh wise freezer king?" He grinned, hopped down from the freezer, and walked over to the snack aisle. Without hesitation, he grabbed a bag of pistachios, a bottle of chocolate milk, and a box of strawberry Pop-Tarts. "Protein for stamina," he said, holding up the pistachios. "Sugar for morale," he added, shaking the Pop-Tarts. "And chocolate milk because, well, it's chocolate milk. Do I need to explain further?" I couldn't tell if he was joking or serious, but his confidence was so ridiculous I couldn't help but laugh. "That's the most unhinged snack combo I've ever heard of." "Maybe," he said, tossing the items into my basket, "but you'll thank me later." I don't know why I listened to him. Maybe it was because he spoke with the authority of someone who'd spent way too much time analyzing gas station snack aisles. Or maybe I just wanted to see if he was right. Either way, I bought the snacks, shoved them into my backpack, and walked out of the gas station shaking my head. I thought that would be the end of it. Just a weird, late-night encounter with a guy who treated snack selection like an Olympic sport. But a week later, I saw him again. This time, I was sitting at a bus stop downtown, trying to figure out if I could make it through the day without falling asleep. I hadn't had coffee, my laptop bag felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds, and my brain was doing that sluggish thing where every thought feels like it's wading through molasses. And then, out of nowhere, there he was, bright yellow sneakers, faded hoodie, and a popsicle in hand. He was walking down the sidewalk like he didn't have a care in the world, humming a song I couldn't quite place. When he saw me, he stopped, tilted his head like he was surprised to see me, and said, "Hey, it's Balanced Snack Combo Guy." I blinked at him, too tired to come up with a witty response. "Do you just wander around giving unsolicited snack advice to strangers?" "Only the ones who look like they need it," he said, sitting down next to me on the bench. "And judging by your face, you need more than just snacks today. Let me guess, long day at work? No caffeine? Existential crisis?" "All of the above," I muttered. He nodded sympathetically, then reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, crumpled packet of gummy bears. "Here, emergency sugar boost." I hesitated, but he shook the packet at me until I took it. "Is this your thing?" I asked, tearing it open. "Just showing up and handing people random snacks?" "Pretty much," he said, leaning back on the bench. "Life's hard. Snacks help." I couldn't argue with that. Over the next few months, Cal seemed to pop up everywhere. He'd appear at the park while I was walking my dog, or at the coffee shop where I worked on weekends, or, once, in the frozen food aisle of the grocery store where he was apparently debating the merits of pizza rolls versus frozen taquitos. Each time, he greeted me like we were old friends. And each time, he had some kind of bizarre wisdom to share. How to tell if a mango is ripe? It's all in the smell. Why the best way to spend a rainy day is building a pillow fort, and why you should never, under any circumstances, try the gas station sushi. "You'd think that last one would be obvious," I said. "You'd be surprised," he replied, shaking his head solemnly. It wasn't until I saw him at a small, hole-in-the-wall arcade that I realized how much I'd started looking forward to these chance encounters. He was leaning against a pinball machine, drinking a cherry slushie and watching a group of kids battle it out on an old Dance Dance Revolution machine. When he saw me, he waved me over without hesitation. "Do you ever sit still?" I asked, laughing as I joined him by the pinball machine. "Rarely," he said. "Sitting still is for people with plans." "And you don't have plans?" "Plans are boring," he said with a shrug. "I just follow where the day takes me." I thought about that for a moment. It was such a wildly different approach to life than mine, where everything was scheduled and organized down to the last detail. "Doesn't that get exhausting?" I asked. "Not really," he said. "It's like surfing. You don't control the wave, you just ride it." It sounded terrifying to me, but the way he said it made it seem almost freeing. By the time we left the arcade that night, I realized I didn't want this to just be a series of random meetings anymore. As we walked out into the cool night air, I turned to him and said, "So, do you ever plan things? Or is that against your philosophy?" He raised an eyebrow. "What kind of things?" "Like hanging out. On purpose. Not just by chance." For the first time since I'd met him, he looked genuinely surprised. Then he grinned and said, "Well, I guess there's a first time for everything." Now, months later, Cal is still as unpredictable as ever. He'll show up at my door with a box of cereal and declare it movie night, without any actual movies in sight. Or he'll text me at 3 a.m. asking if I've ever wondered why keyboards are arranged the way they are. But somehow, his chaos has become a kind of anchor for me. He's the wave I never thought I'd ride, and I'm finally starting to understand what he meant about letting go of plans. Have you ever met someone who turned your perfectly ordered life into a beautiful, exhilarating mess? Because that's what Cal did, and I wouldn't trade it for anything. There's a house at the end of Mayflower Street that only exists when it feels like it. Most of the time, it's just a vacant lot, the kind you'd walk past without a second glance. Overgrown grass, a broken chain-link fence, a concrete slab cracked by years of neglect. But every once in a while, without warning or explanation, the house is there. No one sees it appear. One day it isn't, and the next day it is, standing as if it's always been there. White clapboard siding, a slanted roof with missing shingles, a single light glowing faintly in the upstairs window. I first heard about it when I was 12, the way you hear about most strange things as a kid. Secondhand, from someone who swore their older cousin had seen it. The story was always vague, half-formed. Some people said the house showed up only during storms. Others claimed you could make it appear by standing in the lot at exactly 3 a.m. and whispering your name 3 times. The details didn't matter, though. The important part was that the house wasn't just strange. It was dangerous. Kids who went looking for it didn't always come back. Or if they did, they came back different. No one could agree on what different meant, but the warning was clear enough. Don't go looking for the house. For years, I didn't. I told myself I didn't believe in it, that it was just a story kids told to scare each other, like the one about the ghost dog in the woods behind the school or the blood moon that made you lose your mind if you stared at it too long. But the thing about stories like that is they stick to you, even when you don't want them to. They live in the back of your mind, whispering, nudging, daring. So when I walked past the vacant lot one morning and saw the house sitting there, clear as day, I didn't stop to think. I went inside. The front door was unlocked, though it creaked loudly as I pushed it open. The air inside was heavy, stale, like a room that had been shut up for years. Dust motes swirled in the weak sunlight streaming through the cracked windows, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. The house was smaller than I'd imagined it would be, just a single hallway with 3 doors. One on the left, one on the right, and one at the end. I thought about calling out, "Hello?" Or maybe something braver. But the silence felt too solid, too deliberate, like the house was listening. So I kept quiet. The first door on the left opened into what might have been a living room, though it didn't look like any living room I'd ever seen. The walls were lined with shelves, but instead of books, they were filled with jars. Hundreds of jars, maybe thousands, all of them identical. Plain glass with metal lids, each one containing a small, dark object floating in liquid. I stepped closer to one of the shelves and squinted at the nearest jar, trying to make out what was inside. A feather? No, not a feather. A tiny, perfectly preserved wing. like something you'd find on an insect but sharper, more intricate. I picked up another jar. This one held what looked like a tooth, but longer, narrower, with a strange spiral pattern etched into the enamel. Every jar I picked up was the same. Something small, alien, and just unsettling enough to make my stomach twist. I didn't touch the third jar. I couldn't. It was the way the light hit it, or maybe the way it didn't, that stopped me. The liquid inside was so dark it seemed to absorb the light, and whatever was floating in it was shifting ever so slightly, like it was alive. I put the jars back on the shelf and stepped out of the room, closing the door behind me as quietly as I could. The door on the right led to a kitchen, or at least, it might have been a kitchen once. The counters were bare except for a single plate sitting in the center of the table, and the sink was empty, its faucet dripping slowly, the sound unnervingly loud in the quiet. The wallpaper was peeling, revealing a layer of wood underneath that was scorched black, as though a fire had tried to eat its way through but given up halfway. On the plate sat a single piece of fruit, an apple bright red, with skin so smooth it looked fake. I don't know why, but I didn't touch it. Something about it made my throat tighten, like I was holding back a scream I didn't know I wanted to let out. I moved to the door at the end of the hall, the one that had been closed when I walked in. It wasn't closed anymore. The door was open just a crack, wide enough to see that there was a staircase leading up. A faint light spilled out, the kind of light that doesn't come from bulbs or windows, but from something else entirely. My legs moved before my mind could catch up. I climbed the stairs slowly, each step creaking louder than the last, until I reached the top. The upstairs was nothing like the downstairs. It was smaller, narrower, just a single room with no furniture except for a table in the middle and something lying on it. I stepped closer, my pulse hammering in my ears, and saw that it was a photograph. A Polaroid, curling slightly at the edges, the kind you'd find buried in an old drawer. I picked it up. It was me. Not me exactly, but close enough. A kid standing in the middle of the vacant lot, staring straight at the camera with an expression I couldn't place. The longer I stared at the photo, the more wrong it felt. The kid's clothes were different, older somehow, like something out of the 1970s. Their hair was longer than mine, their face thinner, but the eyes, they were mine. They looked like mine. And beneath the photo, written in blocky, uneven letters, were the words, "Don't follow them." I felt the air shift behind me, and I didn't need to turn around to know I wasn't alone anymore. Something was standing at the top of the stairs, blocking the way down. I could feel it watching me, the same way the house had felt like it was listening earlier. My hand tightened around the photograph, and I thought about running, about jumping out the window if I had to. But then I heard it, the faintest whisper, low and soft, coming from the thing behind me. "You're too early." When I turned around, the stairs were empty. The house was gone. I was standing in the middle of the vacant lot, the photograph still in my hand, the sun just beginning to rise. The Polaroid had faded, its image almost gone, but the words were still there, sharp and clear. Don't follow them. I don't walk past Mayflower Street anymore. Some things don't want to be found twice. I was cleaning out my uncle's shed the day I found the jar. He'd passed away the month before, and no one in the family had known what to do with the place. The man had been a collector of, well, just about everything. The shed was packed floor to ceiling with boxes of dusty tools, faded magazines, old lawn ornaments, and jars. Jars of screws, jars of bolts, jars of rusty washers whose purposes were long forgotten. My mom had said, "Just toss everything. Don't even bother going through it." But I felt guilty about throwing away an entire life without at least looking. I spent the better part of an afternoon sorting through the chaos, making piles for trash, donations, and the few things that seemed vaguely worth keeping. I was elbow-deep in a box of tangled extension cords when I spotted the jar. It sat on the top shelf, pushed back into the shadows, as if it had been hidden on purpose. There was nothing particularly remarkable about it, just a mason jar with a rusted lid. But inside, crammed together in a tight spiral, was a collection of yellowed ticket stubs. I climbed up on an old stool and grabbed it, turning it over in my hands. The jar was heavy, the tickets pressed so tightly against the glass that it looked like they'd been growing in there for decades. I unscrewed the lid and pulled one out carefully, afraid it might crumble. It was thin, almost translucent, the edges worn soft. Faint black text read, "Admit one. Greenfield Carnival, 1987. My chest gave a strange little jolt, and I pulled out another ticket. This one was a different color, a pale orange with the words, "Ferris wheel, good for one ride." And then another, "Popcorn, redeemed." They weren't all from the same place, or even the same time. There were movie tickets, state fair stubs, raffle entries, and parking passes. Some were so faded I could barely make out the print, but others were still bright, their colors stubbornly refusing to fade. Each one felt like a fragment of something bigger. As I sifted through the tickets, I started to notice small handwritten notes on some of them, scrawled in pencil or pen. On the back of a blue ticket that said "Midnight Train, third car," there were the words, "First time we skipped school." On another stub, this one from an arcade, someone had written, "200 points on Frogger. Should have been 300. I felt like I was reading a code, a breadcrumb trail leading back to memories I didn't even know existed. I kept going, pulling out ticket after ticket, until one made my breath catch. It was small and pink, with the words 2 p.m. showing, "Dinosaurs Unleashed," and on the back, in my uncle's familiar scrawl, it said, "With Timmy, age 9. I stared at it for a long time, the dusty air in the shed growing still around me. Timmy, that was me. I hadn't thought about that day in years. But suddenly, I could see it all so clearly. The way he'd picked me up in his old truck, the vinyl seat hot against my legs because I'd refused to wear long pants in the summer heat. He'd bought us tickets to the planetarium's traveling dinosaur exhibit, and I'd spent the entire afternoon running between animatronic T-Rexes and dusty glass cases of fossils, asking him every question that popped into my head. Do you think dinosaurs ever had favorite trees? Did they know they were going extinct? What if they were just big birds? He'd answered every single one with the patience of someone who had nowhere else to be. It wasn't an extraordinary day. There wasn't some big, cinematic moment that defined it. But I remembered how he'd bought me popcorn afterward, despite the fact that he hated the smell, and how he'd let me keep the ticket stub even though I'd spilled soda all over his truck on the way home. I remembered him laughing when I'd fallen asleep mid-sentence, my head leaning against the passenger side window. I'd forgotten that day entirely, not out of neglect, but because it had simply faded into the sea of other childhood memories, blurred and distant. And yet, here it was, staring back at me from the back of a crumpled ticket stub, resurrected like it had been waiting in that jar for me to find it. I sat down on the shed floor, the jar in my lap, and kept digging. The more tickets I pulled out, the more pieces of him I found. Notes in his handwriting that painted a picture of someone I thought I already knew. "Ferris wheel with Maggie," she cried at the top. Maggie, my mom. Winning raffle at county fair. Should have shared the pie. First baseball game with Dad, 1968. Got sunburned, didn't care. Some of them were just dates or single words, but they all carried the weight of something real, something lived. By the time the jar was empty, the light in the shed had shifted, golden streaks spilling through the cracks in the walls. My knees were sore, my hands smudged with dust, but I felt lighter, like I'd been handed something fragile and precious. I couldn't stop thinking about how quiet he'd been in life. Not unkind, just not the sort to talk much about himself. And yet, in this jar, he'd left behind a map of who he was. Not in grand gestures or big speeches, but in tiny, ordinary moments that he'd cared enough to keep. I packed up the rest of the shed like I was on autopilot, the jar tucked safely in the passenger seat of my car by the time I was done. That night, I spread the tickets out on my kitchen table, laying them in rows like I was piecing together a puzzle. And in a way, I was. I don't know what I'll do with them yet. Maybe I'll frame a few. Maybe I'll keep the jar just as it was, a time capsule of a man who loved quietly and paid attention to the little things. Or maybe I'll start my own jar. The thought feels strange, like stepping into shoes too big for me, but I like the idea of leaving behind a trail of breadcrumbs. Not for anyone else necessarily, but for myself. Have you ever stumbled across something so small, so insignificant, yet so full of meaning that it cracked you open in ways you didn't expect? Something that made you realize how much of life is stitched together by the moments we think are too small to matter? It wasn't the kind of town you visited on purpose. You'd pass through it if you were headed somewhere else, maybe stop for gas if you didn't know better. That's what I told myself anyway, because I hadn't meant to end up in the middle of nowhere, staring at a rusting sign that read, "Welcome to Antrim," in faded green letters. I'd been driving for hours, following a map app that had gotten confused in the hills, and by the time I realized I was lost, the sun had dipped below the horizon. The road narrowed until it felt like it might disappear altogether, swallowed by the trees that leaned in too close, their branches clawing at the sky. The gas light blinked on, a quiet betrayal, and I cursed under my breath. A few minutes later, I saw the first house, its porch light buzzing faintly in the distance. Then another, and another. The road widened slightly, the trees thinning, and soon I was rolling into what must have been the center of town, if you could call it that. The gas station was easy to spot. One of those old ones with a single pump and a sign that hadn't been updated since the 70s. It was lit by a single floodlight that flickered every few seconds, as if it wasn't sure it could handle staying on. I pulled in, the tires crunching over gravel, and stepped out into the cold. The air was sharper here, cleaner, but it carried a strange scent, something metallic, almost electric, that I couldn't place. The pump looked ancient, the kind of machine you weren't sure still worked. I glanced toward the small convenience store attached to the station, its windows dark, and hesitated. There was a sign taped to the pump, scrawled in uneven handwriting, "Prepay inside." Of course. The door to the store jingled as I stepped inside, and I was immediately hit by the scent of dust and something faintly sweet, like old candy. The shelves were sparsely stocked, filled with items that looked like they hadn't been touched in years. Behind the counter stood an old man, his face lined with deep creases that made him look like he'd been carved out of wood. He didn't look up right away, his focus fixed on a radio that was playing static with occasional bursts of music, like it was picking up fragments from somewhere far away. "Pump 2, I said, pulling a 20 from my wallet and sliding it across the counter. The man finally looked up, his eyes sharp and clear, startling in contrast to the rest of him. He glanced at the money, then back at me. "You're passing through," he said, not a question but a statement. "Yeah," I replied, trying to sound casual. "Just need enough to get to the highway." He stared at me for a moment longer than felt comfortable, then nodded. "Highway's west, but you won't find it tonight." I frowned. "What do you mean?" "Road gets tricky after dark," he said, his voice calm but firm, like he was explaining something to a child. "Best to wait till morning." I wanted to argue, but something in his tone made me hesitate. Instead, I muttered, "Thanks," and stepped back outside. The pump groaned as it dispensed gas, the numbers on the dial ticking up slowly. I leaned against the car, staring out at the empty street. The town was quiet, too quiet. No hum of distant traffic, no chatter from nearby houses, just the faint buzz of the floodlight overhead. That's when I noticed the figure. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the flickering bulb, but as I squinted, I realized there was someone standing at the edge of the street, just beyond the reach of the light. They weren't moving. I straightened, my pulse quickening, and glanced toward the convenience store. The old man was still inside, his outline visible through the window, but he didn't seem to notice the figure. When I looked back, they were gone. The pump clicked off, jolting me out of my thoughts. I replaced the nozzle, climbed into the car, and locked the doors. The tank was just under half full, not ideal, but enough to get me to the next town. I pulled out of the station and headed back the way I'd come, retracing my route through the narrow streets. The houses looked different now, their windows dark and their porches empty, as if the entire town had gone to sleep in the time it had taken me to fill up. I found the main road and turned west, the headlights carving a narrow path through the darkness. The trees closed in again, their branches casting jagged shadows that danced across the hood. It wasn't until I'd driven for 10 minutes that I realized something was wrong. The road hadn't curved. Not once. I slowed the car, glancing at the map on my phone, but the screen was blank. No service, no GPS, just a spinning wheel where my location should have been. I swore under my breath and kept driving, gripping the wheel tightly. A few minutes later, I passed the gas station. My foot slammed on the brake, the tires skidding slightly on the gravel. I stared out the window, my heart pounding. It was the same station, same pump, same flickering floodlight. I turned the car around and drove back the way I'd come, certain I must have made a wrong turn somewhere. 10 minutes later, I passed the gas station again. Panic set in, cold and sharp, as I pulled into the lot and parked. The convenience store lights were still on, and the old man was still behind the counter, staring at his radio. I stepped inside, the door jingling behind me, and he looked up as if he'd been expecting me. "You're still here," he said, his tone matter of fact. My voice cracked. "I can't get out. I keep ending up back here." He nodded slowly, as if this was something he'd heard before. "The road doesn't like to let people go after dark." "What the hell does that mean?" "It's not the road's fault," he said, almost apologetically. "You shouldn't have come this way tonight." I wanted to shout at him, demand answers, but something in his expression stopped me. Instead, I asked, "What do I do?" He reached under the counter and pulled out a small lantern, its glass smudged and cracked. "Take this," he said, sliding it toward me. "Walk east until the sun rises. Don't look back." "Walk?" I stammered. "What about my car?" He shook his head. "The car won't help you now." I stared at the lantern, my stomach twisting. The old man met my eyes, his gaze steady but not unkind. "The road isn't yours anymore," he said softly. The words settled over me like a weight I couldn't shake. Outside, the night stretched on, vast and endless. The lantern felt heavier than it should have as I picked it up and stepped into the dark. The day the forest changed, I wasn't even supposed to be there. I'd agreed to take my friend Naomi's dog, Jasper, for a walk while she went to her niece's recital. Jasper was a bundle of nervous energy, part greyhound, part mystery, and all legs. He was the kind of dog who looked guilty even when he hadn't done anything wrong, but he was sweet, and I didn't mind. Naomi had told me to stick to the park near her house, but I'd had a long day, and the thought of circling the same manicured lawns felt suffocating. Instead, I took him to Ashwood Preserve, a nature trail I used to explore as a kid but hadn't visited in years. It was wilder than I remembered, the kind of place where you could walk for miles and not see another soul. The trees were thicker now, their branches knitting together to block out most of the sky, and the air smelled sharp and green, like damp moss and pine needles. Jasper seemed thrilled by the change of scenery, his tail wagging furiously as he darted ahead and sniffed everything in sight. The trail wound deeper into the woods, and soon the noise of the world faded away. No cars, no distant hum of highways, just the rustle of leaves and the occasional chirp of birds. I don't know how long we walked before I noticed it. The quiet, not just a lull in the usual forest sounds, but an absence. No wind, no birdsong. Even Jasper had stopped, his ears perked, his body stiff with attention. The air felt heavier, charged with something I couldn't name. I called for him softly, and he came trotting back, his eyes wide and uncertain. I thought about turning around, heading back to the car, but the path ahead was bathed in a faint golden light that hadn't been there before. It wasn't sunlight. It was too soft, too warm, like the glow of a lantern, and it was moving. I followed it. It wasn't bravery that made me keep walking, or curiosity, exactly. It was more like the light was pulling me, tugging at something deep in my chest. Jasper stayed close to my side, his nose twitching furiously as if he could smell something I couldn't. The light led us off the main trail, down a narrow path I didn't remember ever seeing before. That's when I saw the door. It was set into the base of an enormous oak tree, the kind of tree that must have been growing there for centuries. The bark had grown around the frame as if the tree had swallowed it, but the door itself was smooth and dark, made of what I couldn't identify. It had no handle, no hinges, just a small circular window in the center, too dirty to see through. The light pooled around the door, shimmering faintly, and for a moment, I swore I could hear something. A faint hum, low and steady, like the vibrations of a distant bell. Jasper let out a low whine, pressing himself against my leg. I knelt down to touch the door, my fingers brushing against the cool, smooth surface. The second I made contact, the hum grew louder, filling the air around me, vibrating in my bones. The window and the door cleared, like fog evaporating from glass, and I found myself staring into a place I couldn't understand. It wasn't the other side of the forest. It wasn't even night. It was somewhere else. The sky was a deep, bruised purple, streaked with ribbons of green and gold. Towering structures loomed in the distance, not buildings exactly, but massive shapes that seemed to pulse faintly, as if they were alive. The ground was covered in something soft and shifting, like grass made of light, and figures moved through it, tall, slender shapes that flickered in and out of sight, as if they were only half real. I couldn't move. I couldn't look away. And then one of them saw me. It turned its head, or what I assumed was its head, slowly, and though it had no eyes, I could feel its gaze, sharp and cold as a blade. Its body shimmered, shifting between solid and translucent, and when it took a step toward the window, I felt my chest tighten, as if all the air had been sucked out of the forest. Jasper barked, loud and sudden, breaking the spell. I stumbled back, my heart hammering, and the door slammed shut on its own, the hum cutting off abruptly. The light vanished, plunging the woods into twilight. For a long moment, I just stood there, my breath coming in short, ragged gasps. Jasper pressed against me, trembling slightly, his eyes darting around the clearing as if expecting the door to open again. But it didn't. The air felt lighter now, the weight of that presence gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching us. I forced myself to turn around and walk back to the main trail, my legs unsteady beneath me. Jasper stayed close, his usual enthusiasm replaced by a quiet vigilance that made my skin crawl. By the time we reached the car, the sun had dipped below the horizon, and the first stars were winking into view. I didn't tell Naomi what happened. I wasn't sure how to explain it, or if I even wanted to. The next morning, I drove back to the preserve, intending to find the path again, to convince myself it had just been a trick of the light or a dream I hadn't fully woken from. But the trail was gone. I looked for hours, circling the same stretch of woods, retracing my steps until the frustration and unease made me give up. The tree with the door wasn't there. The narrow path wasn't there. Even Jasper, usually so eager for adventure, hung back near the car, as if he wanted no part of whatever I was looking for. But sometimes, late at night, I think about that place beyond the door, about the figures that flickered like shadows on water, about the thing that turned and saw me, and I wonder if, somewhere, it's still looking. The first time I saw her, she was standing barefoot in the middle of a laundromat, holding a single sock like it was the most tragic thing in the world. She had one hand on her hip, the sock dangling limply from the other, and an expression that teetered between frustration and bemusement. "It's gone," she said, mostly to herself but loud enough for everyone in the room to hear. Her voice had this slight rasp to it, like she'd been yelling at a concert the night before. How does something just disappear in a 5-foot-wide machine? The laundromat was nearly empty. Just me, a guy in a hoodie who'd fallen asleep on a row of plastic chairs, and the woman who had apparently lost a sock to the void. I had earbuds in, but I paused my music, too curious to pretend I wasn't listening. She didn't seem to notice me watching. She turned back to the dryer, crouched down, and stuck her entire head inside it, like she was prepared to interrogate the machine for answers. "You okay over there?" I asked finally, unable to stop myself. She pulled her head out of the dryer and turned to me, her hair sticking up in static-fueled spikes. "Do I look okay?" she asked, holding up the lone sock for emphasis. It was purple with tiny yellow pineapples on it. An objectively great sock. I'm down one pineapple. I'm practically limping through life now. I couldn't help but laugh. "You're really committed to that sock?" "You don't understand," she said, pointing at me with the pineapple sock like it was a weapon. "It's not just about the sock. It's about the principle. The audacity of this dryer to eat part of my life and act like nothing happened. Maybe it's in another machine?" I offered. She squinted at me like I just suggested she rob a bank. "You think my sock escaped and fled to another dryer? Like it's leading some kind of secret sock rebellion?" I shrugged. Stranger things have happened. She considered this for a moment, then sighed dramatically. "Fine. You win. I'll check." She went over to the next dryer, flung open the door, and started pulling out someone else's clothes with zero hesitation. "Not mine," she muttered, tossing a t-shirt back into the machine. "Not mine. Definitely not mine. EW, whose are these?" She held up a pair of boxers with her fingertips like they were radioactive, then quickly shoved them back into the dryer. "Pretty sure that's not how this works," I said. "Pretty sure you're not the sock police," she shot back. But there was a spark of a smile tugging at the corner of her mouth. Eventually, she gave up, slamming the last dryer shut with more force than necessary. She stood there for a moment, staring at her lone pineapple sock like it might apologize to her if she waited long enough. Then she turned back to me. "I hope you realize I've just endured a great tragedy in front of you," she said. "The least you can do is buy me a coffee to cheer me up." I blinked. "What?" "You heard me," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm a victim of sock theft. You owe me emotional support in the form of caffeine." I didn't know whether to laugh or be impressed by her sheer audacity. Probably both. "You're not even going to ask if I'm busy? Are you?" "Well, no." "Then there's your answer." And that's how I ended up walking out of the laundromat with a complete stranger, her pineapple sock tucked into her coat pocket like a tiny flag of defeat. We found a coffee shop a few blocks away, one of those places that had mismatched furniture and chalkboard menus filled with drink names I couldn't pronounce. She ordered a latte and a giant blueberry muffin, then plopped down in a chair by the window, gesturing for me to sit across from her. "So," she said, unwrapping the muffin like it was a Christmas present, "what's your deal?" "My deal?" "Yeah. You don't just get to watch me spiral into madness over a sock and then disappear without telling me who you are. That's not how this works." I hesitated. "There's not much to tell, honestly. I just moved here a couple of weeks ago. Job transfer. Exciting." "Not really. It's accounting." "Oof," she said, wincing. "How'd you end up in that?" "Numbers make sense," I said with a shrug. "They're reliable. Logical." "That's such an accountant thing to say," she muttered, taking a bite of her muffin. "What do you do for fun? Let me guess. Sudoku?" I laughed, despite myself. "Okay, your turn. What's your deal?" She leaned back in her chair, sipping her latte like she had all the time in the world. "I'm a florist." Sort of. Sort of. Well, technically, I run a flower shop, but I'm not very good at keeping plants alive. Or organized. Or, running a business. How are you still in business, then? She shrugged. Sheer charm and the occasional miracle. People like me because I'll tell them when their bouquet ideas are terrible. Like, last week, this guy came in and wanted to send his ex a dozen black roses with a note that just said, "Think about it." I told him to grow up and go buy a cactus instead. I snorted into my coffee. And he didn't storm out? Oh, he definitely stormed out. But he'll be back. They always are. The more we talked, the more I realized she was the kind of person who filled up every space she was in. Like her presence came with its own gravity. She didn't just talk. She performed, using her hands, her expressions, her entire body to punctuate every story. It was impossible not to get swept up in it, even when I had no idea how we'd veered from one topic to the next. One moment she was ranting about how daisies were the least trustworthy flowers, and the next she was telling me about the time she got locked in a department store overnight because she'd fallen asleep in a recliner. By the time we finished our coffee, it felt like I'd known her for years instead of an hour. We walked back toward the laundromat together, her broken suitcase rattling along the uneven pavement. When we reached the corner where we'd met, she stopped and turned to me. "Well," she said, pulling the pineapple sock out of her pocket and holding it up like a trophy, "thanks for the coffee. And the moral support." "Anytime," I said. "Good luck with your, floral empire." She grinned. "Good luck with your numbers." And then, just like that, she was gone, dragging her suitcase off toward whatever strange corner of the world she'd come from. I stood there for a moment, watching her go, and then I turned back toward my own direction, the city feeling a little less overwhelming than it had that morning. I don't know why I think about her sometimes. Maybe it's the way she barreled into my life like a small, determined hurricane, leaving behind nothing but a laugh and a half-empty cup of coffee. Or maybe it's because, every now and then, I wonder if she ever found her missing sock, or if she even cared. Have you ever met someone who reminded you how much fun it is to be caught off guard? There's this peculiar thing I do when I start liking someone. I mentally assign them a sound. Not a song, not a playlist, but a sound. A singular tone or noise that, for some reason, encapsulates everything I feel about them. It's not intentional, and it's not something I tell anyone about, because, let's face it, it sounds absolutely bizarre. But it's like my brain takes the overwhelming chaos of attraction and boils it down to one sound that gets stuck in my head whenever I think about them. The first time I noticed this was with someone I used to work with, a woman named Erica. Erica's sound was the click of a typewriter. I couldn't explain it. She didn't even use a typewriter. She wasn't particularly old-fashioned, and it's not like we worked in publishing or anything like that. We were both stuck in the marketing department of some bland corporate office. But every time she walked by, every time she tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear or tilted her head in that curious way she did, my brain would go, click, click, ding, like she was typing out a letter in a language I couldn't read but desperately wanted to understand. It wasn't even distracting, it was comforting. I started hearing it when I worked on my own projects, too, as if Erica's typewriter click rhythm had somehow synced up with my thoughts. When I finally got to know her, it almost felt like I was violating the little soundscape I'd built in my head. She didn't move or speak in the precise, measured way I'd imagined. She was chaotic, full of sudden bursts of energy and loud, unfiltered laughter. Her desk was a mess of coffee mugs and sticky notes with cryptic scribbles like, "Call Gary Ree, Narwhals?" There was nothing typewriter-like about her in real life, but the sound stuck anyway. Even when we were at the bar after work, talking about everything from indie films to how neither of us understood the appeal of kombucha, I'd hear the soft click of a typewriter in the back of my mind. It wasn't hers anymore. It was mine. After Erica, I started noticing it happening with other people. Each crush came with their own sound. There was Jamie, who worked at the local hardware store. His sound was the low whir of a power drill starting up. Steady, controlled, efficient. It wasn't romantic, exactly, but there was something grounding about it. Jamie had this way of making you feel like everything was under control, like no problem was too big to solve. Once, I walked in looking for a replacement part for a lamp I'd somehow managed to destroy, and without missing a beat, he handed me the exact thing I needed and said, "You look like someone who knows their way around duct tape." That's when the sound started. The quiet hum of a drill, building something out of chaos. And then there was May. Oh, May's sound was the best. Hers was the high, metallic ping of a coin being flicked into the air. There was something so electric about her, like she carried a charge wherever she went. May wasn't a coin-flipping kind of person, but she felt like one. Unpredictable, a little reckless, but endlessly exciting. She had this habit of answering questions with more questions, keeping you constantly on your toes. "What's your favorite movie?" I asked her once, and she grinned and said, "What's yours? And why? And does it change depending on your mood?" Ping, like a coin spinning midair, waiting to land. But not every sound was a good one. There was Liam, a guy I briefly dated last summer. His sound was the steady drip of a faucet leaking. I ignored it at first, thinking maybe I was overthinking the whole sound thing, but I couldn't shake it. Every time I was around him, that dripping noise crept into my mind. It wasn't soothing, it was maddening. It made me feel restless, like something was wrong but I couldn't figure out what. I finally broke things off after realizing the dripping sound wasn't a warning about him. It was about me, about how I was holding on to something I didn't actually want, waiting for it to fix itself when I knew it wouldn't. After Liam, I decided to pay closer attention to the sounds. It's not like I can predict them, though. That's the strangest part. I don't choose the sounds, they just happen. And sometimes they surprise me. There was this one time I started seeing a guy named Aaron, and his sound was the opening notes of a video game startup screen. I don't even play video games, but the sound felt perfect for him. Aaron was one of those people who loved the feeling of beginning something new. He was all about the potential of things. New hobbies, new projects, new adventures. He made every date feel like the start of a co-op campaign. I'd hear those little pixelated chimes in my head every time he texted me something like, Want to try rock climbing next weekend? Or, think you'd survive an escape room with me? We didn't last long. He moved to another city for work, but I still think of him whenever I hear those retro sound effects. I don't know if these sounds are real, like some weird, subconscious synesthesia, or if they're just a quirk my brain made up to entertain itself. Either way, I've come to love it. It feels like my way of seeing the world, like my brain has its own secret language for the way people make me feel. It's never something big or dramatic, like violins swelling or an entire symphony. It's always something small, simple, human. And now there's someone new. Her name is Talia, and I can't figure her sound out yet. She works at the bakery near my apartment, and she's got this unhurried, grounded way about her, like nothing could ever rattle her. When she needs dough, her hands move like they've been doing it for centuries, like the process is as natural to her as breathing. The first time we talked, I was fumbling for my wallet, apologizing for holding up the line, and she just smiled and said, "Don't rush. Bread takes time, so why shouldn't people?" Her voice was low and warm, like a cello string being plucked. That might be her sound, actually, the deep thrum of a cello, but I'm not sure yet. I keep going back for more bread, more small talk, hoping I'll hear it clearly one of these days. So that's my secret. I hear people and sounds. Not songs, not music, just simple, distinct noises that feel like pieces of them etched into my mind. It's strange, I know, but it makes the world feel richer, like every crush or connection adds a new layer to the soundtrack of my life. And now I wonder, do you have anything like this? A way your brain quietly captures the people who matter to you. Maybe it's not sounds, maybe it's colors, or smells, or something else entirely. But if you have something, I'd love to know. Maybe we're all just piecing together the world in our own little ways. There's a woman who lives in my attic. I know how that sounds. But before you call the cops, hear me out. She's not squatting. She's not hiding up there like some sinister ghost in a horror movie. She pays rent. Real rent. $50 a month, cash, slipped under the kitchen door on the first day of every month. I never see her do it, but it's always there. Crumpled 20s and tins. I don't even know if she has a bank account. Her name is Estelle. Or at least, that's what the note she left said when I first moved in. "Hi," it read, in thin, spidery handwriting. "I live upstairs. My name's Estelle. I don't come down. Please don't come up. Here's $50 for rent. Thanks." That was it. No explanation. No phone number. Just a $50 bill paperclipped to the note, sitting on the counter like it had been waiting for me. At first, I thought it was a joke. Some kind of elaborate prank played by the previous tenant, or maybe the landlord trying to test my patience. But when I asked him about it, all he said was, "Oh, yeah, she's harmless. Don't worry about it." That's the thing about this house. Everyone seems to know about Estelle, but no one talks about her. The landlord mentioned her in passing like she was a leaky faucet or a weirdly loud pipe. The neighbors shrugged when I brought it up, like having a mysterious attic woman was a perfectly normal part of life. One even said, "Oh, she's been there forever. We just figured you'd be fine with it." And somehow I was. Estelle doesn't make noise. She doesn't stomp around or drop heavy objects or shuffle boxes across the floorboards. If it weren't for the occasional sound of humming, soft and distant, like a radio left on in another room, I wouldn't know she was there at all. Except, of course, for the notes. They started showing up after my first month. Just little slips of paper, folded neatly and left on the counter where I'd find them in the morning. They weren't creepy, exactly, just strange. "Don't leave the kitchen window open too long. Birds will get in. The basement door sticks in the winter. You'll need to jiggle the knob. Your car tires are a little low. Check the pressure before your next drive." She was right about the window, and the basement door, and the tires. That's what unsettled me the most. Not that she knew these things, but that she was always right. One time, I tested her. Left a note of my own on the counter. "What's the weather going to be like tomorrow?" The next morning, her reply was waiting for me. "Rain. Bring an umbrella." It rained. After that, I stopped questioning her. Estelle knows things. Not just about the house, but about me. Little things I didn't think anyone noticed, like how I like my coffee, too much sugar, Or which books I keep rereading but never finish, 3 of them currently. She even knows when I've had a bad day. Long day? One of her notes said after I got home from a brutal work meeting, "There's a bottle of wine in the pantry. Top shelf." There was. I hadn't bought it. Once, during a particularly rough stretch, I wrote back, "How do you always know?" Her reply came the next morning. "I pay attention." It wasn't creepy. It wasn't invasive. It was just Estelle. Sometimes I wondered if she ever left the attic. If she slipped out during the night when I was asleep, creeping down the stairs to the kitchen or out into the world. But I never found any footprints, never saw the faint outline of someone's hand on the dust of a shelf. It was as if she didn't need to leave, like the attic itself was enough for her. Occasionally, I thought about going up there, about breaking the unspoken rule and climbing the creaky ladder to knock on the attic door. But something always stopped me. Not fear, exactly, more like respect. She'd asked me not to, and somehow, I felt like breaking that rule would unravel something I couldn't put back together. Still, there were moments when curiosity got the better of me. I'd catch myself staring at the ceiling, wondering what she did up there all day. Did she have furniture? A bed? A kitchen? Did she cook? Or did she live off of crackers and can food like some ascetic monk? One night, after a particularly stressful week, I left her a note. Not a question this time, just an invitation. Pizza night downstairs. If you want to join, I'll leave the door unlocked. The next morning, there was a reply. Thanks, but no. I don't come down. Enjoy the pizza. I don't know why that note made me so sad. Months turned into a year, and Estelle became part of my routine. Her notes guided me through home repairs, weather forecasts, even life advice. Take the job, one note had said after I'd agonized for days about a new offer. You'll be happier. She was right. But one day, the note stopped. No rent money on the first of the month. No folded papers on the counter. No soft humming from the attic. Just silence. At first, I thought something had happened to her. I knocked on the ceiling, gently at first, then harder. No response. The landlord shrugged when I brought it up. If she's gone, he said. But she couldn't just be gone. People don't just vanish, right? That night, I finally broke the rule. I climbed the ladder, pushed open the attic hatch, and peeked inside. It was empty. Not empty like someone had packed up and left. Empty like no one had ever lived there. No furniture. No boxes. No footprints in the dust. Just a single folded piece of paper in the middle of the floor. I picked it up, my hands trembling. "Thank you," it read. "Take care of the house." I never saw her again, but sometimes when I pull open the kitchen drawer and find exactly what I need, or when the basement door sticks and I jiggle the knob without thinking, I wonder if she's still watching. Would you want someone like Estelle in your life? Or would you climb into the attic on day one? Because honestly, I think I'd take her silence over the emptiness any day. The stranger at the bus stop wasn't supposed to matter. He was just another person in the background of a Wednesday afternoon. The kind of person you see and forget before the thought even registers. I only noticed him because he was holding an umbrella, even though the sky was perfectly clear. Not a cloud, not a hint of rain. Just a man with a cheap black umbrella, standing as still as a statue under the flickering glow of a street lamp. It wasn't just the umbrella that caught my attention, though. It was the way he was holding it, clutched tightly against his chest like it was something precious. Like it wasn't an umbrella at all, but a secret he didn't want anyone to see. I didn't think much of it at first. Weird people exist. They cluster in places like bus stops and laundromats and grocery store aisles, living their lives on the edges of normalcy. I kept my eyes on my phone, scrolling aimlessly, waiting for my bus to show up. But something about him made me glance back up. He was looking at me, not in a casual, our eyes met by accident kind of way, but in a deliberate, unblinking way that made the hair on the back of my neck prickle. His face was pale and thin, almost gaunt, and his eyes were dark, too dark, like they absorbed light instead of reflecting it. He didn't say anything. He just stared at me, his grip tightening on the umbrella. I wanted to look away, but I couldn't. "Do you want it?" he asked suddenly, his voice soft and raspy, like he hadn't spoken in a long time. I blinked. "What?" "The umbrella," he said, holding it out toward me. His hands were shaking, just slightly. "Do you want it?" It was such a strange question that, for a moment, I didn't know how to respond. The bus stop wasn't exactly the kind of place where you expected to be offered free things by strangers, especially not umbrellas. "No, thanks," I said cautiously. "I'm good." His expression didn't change. He just kept holding it out, his arms stiff and trembling. "Take it," he said, more firmly this time. "You need it more than I do." I almost laughed. "It's not even raining." He didn't smile, didn't move. "It will be," he said. Something in his voice made me stop. It wasn't a prediction or a guess. It was a certainty, the kind that settles in your bones and makes you feel like the universe has already decided something for you. Against my better judgment, I reached out and took the umbrella. The moment my fingers touched it, the man let out a long, shuddering sigh, like he'd been holding his breath for hours. Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, disappearing around the corner so quickly it was like he'd been swallowed by the city. I stood there for a while, the umbrella in my hands, feeling strangely uneasy. It wasn't heavy, but it wasn't light either. The handle was smooth, worn down like it had been held by 1,000 hands before mine. There was a faint, silvery mark etched into the fabric near the top, a symbol I didn't recognize, something that looked almost like an hourglass tipped on its side. The bus pulled up, and I climbed on, the umbrella still clutched in my hand. It wasn't until later that I realized he was right. It rained that night. Not a drizzle, but a torrential downpour that came out of nowhere, flooding streets and sending people running for cover. I stood in my apartment window, watching the rain hammer against the glass, the umbrella leaning against the wall behind me. I thought about the man's face, the way he'd stared at me like he knew something I didn't. The rain lasted for hours, but that wasn't the strange part. The strange part came the next morning. When I opened the umbrella to check if it had dried out, I saw something I hadn't noticed before. The fabric on the inside wasn't black, like the outside. It was covered in words. Thousands of them. They were written in tiny, spidery handwriting that twisted and overlapped, covering every inch of the umbrella's surface. Names, dates, phrases in languages I couldn't understand. Some of the words looked old, faded, as though they'd been written decades ago. Others were sharp and fresh, the ink still glossy under the light. I ran my fingers over the writing, half expecting it to smudge, but it didn't. It was as though the words were woven into the fabric itself. And then I found my name. It was tucked into the corner of one of the panels, almost hidden among the other words. But it was there, clear as day. My name, written in the same jagged handwriting, followed by a date. Tomorrow's date. I dropped the umbrella. For the rest of the day, I couldn't stop thinking about it. I wanted to tell myself it was a coincidence, that someone else with my name had owned the umbrella before me. But I couldn't shake the feeling that it wasn't a mistake, that the man at the bus stop hadn't picked me at random. When tomorrow came, I didn't go to work. I didn't leave my apartment at all. I spent the whole day staring at the umbrella, waiting for, I don't know what, but nothing happened. By midnight, I felt ridiculous. I picked up the umbrella, meaning to throw it out, but something stopped me. A flicker of movement, just out of the corner of my eye. I opened it again. There were new words now, in the same spidery handwriting. "You changed it." I stared at the words until my vision blurred. I don't carry the umbrella anymore, but I can't bring myself to get rid of it. It leans against the corner of my bedroom, closed and silent, like it's waiting for me to make the next move. And every now and then, when the world feels too quiet, I open it and read the new words that have appeared. Sometimes they're warnings. Sometimes they're instructions. Sometimes they're questions I don't know how to answer. Have you ever held something you didn't ask for, but somehow knew was meant for you? Something that changed the way you looked at everything, even though you didn't understand why? There's a town in the middle of the desert called Stillmark. You won't find it on any map. It doesn't have a sign announcing its name or its existence. If you ask the locals how they got there, most of them will shrug and say something vague like, "I followed the road." If you ask them why they stayed, they'll usually say, "Where else would I go?" But if you ask them about the bell, they'll all go quiet. The first time I saw Stillmark, I was 3 days into a road trip that was supposed to be about finding myself. At least, that's what I told people when they asked why I was driving alone through the middle of nowhere with a duffel bag full of snacks and a playlist I'd cobbled together at the last minute. The truth was, I didn't know what I was looking for. My life back home felt like a shoebox I'd outgrown, and I wanted something bigger, something I couldn't name. I thought the open road might give me answers. I almost didn't see the turnoff. The desert stretched flat and endless in every direction, the asphalt shimmering in the heat. I'd passed 100 miles of scrub and sand without so much as a gas station, and I was starting to wonder if I'd taken a wrong turn somewhere. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a dirt road cutting off to the right. There was no sign, no marker, just a faint groove in the earth that looked like it had been worn down by years of tires. I can't explain why, but I took it. Something about it pulled at me, like a thread unraveling a sweater. The road was bumpy and narrow, winding through the desert like it had been laid out by someone with no sense of direction. After a while, the scrub gave way to buildings. Small, squat structures made of adobe and wood, their roofs sagging under the weight of time. The town looked like it had been plucked out of a different era, untouched by the world outside. I pulled up in front of what looked like a diner, the kind of place with faded red vinyl booths and a jukebox that probably hadn't worked in years. A bell jingled as I pushed open the door. The air inside was thick and warm, smelling faintly of coffee and fried food. A woman behind the counter glanced up from a crossword puzzle. She had sharp features and hair the color of steel wool, tied back in a no-nonsense bun. "You lost?" she asked, not unkindly. "Maybe," I said. "What's this place?" "Stillmark," she said, like that should have been obvious. I ordered a coffee and sat by the window, watching the handful of people outside go about their lives. There was an old man sweeping the steps of a general store, a woman hanging laundry on a line, a boy chasing a stray dog down the street. Everything felt slow, not lazy, exactly, but deliberate, like the town was moving to a rhythm only it could hear. I was halfway through my coffee when I heard it for the first time, the bell. It rang once, a low, resonant note that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I looked around, expecting someone to react, but no one did. The woman behind the counter kept working on her crossword. The man sweeping the steps didn't even pause. It was like I was the only one who heard it. "What's that sound?" I asked, but she didn't look up. "Don't worry about it," she said, her tone flat. "Is it a church bell or something?" I pressed. She sighed and set down her pen. "Listen, if you want to stay here, you're welcome to. But don't ask about the bell. Don't go looking for it. Just leave it alone." That should have been my cue to leave, but something about the way she said it made me want to do the opposite. It wasn't just curiosity, it was compulsion. The bell had wrapped itself around me, a thread pulling tighter and tighter. I decided to stay the night. The motel at the edge of town was barely more than a row of rooms with peeling paint and a flickering neon sign. The man at the front desk handed me a key without asking my name or how long I planned to stay. "Room 7, he said, his voice as dry as the air outside. That night, I lay awake on the stiff motel bed, staring at the cracked ceiling. The town was silent, the kind of silence that presses down on you, heavy and suffocating. And then, just as I was drifting off, the bell rang again. It was louder this time, closer, the sound rippling through the darkness like a stone dropped into still water. Without thinking, I got up and pulled on my shoes. The town was deserted. The streets were bathed in pale moonlight, the buildings casting long, jagged shadows. The bell rang again, and I followed the sound. It led me past the diner, past the general store, past the last row of houses, to the edge of the desert. There, in the middle of a flat expanse of sand, stood a single, massive bell. It was suspended from a wooden frame, its surface tarnished and weathered, etched with symbols I didn't recognize. I walked closer, the sand crunching under my feet. The air around the bell felt heavier, like it was pulling something out of me. I reached out to touch it, but before my fingers could make contact, the air shifted. I turned and saw someone standing a few feet away. It was the woman from the diner. She didn't look angry or surprised, just tired. "I told you not to come here," she said. "What is this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. She hesitated, then sighed. "The bell doesn't belong to this town. It doesn't belong anywhere. It just shows up. It calls to people. Some of them hear it and leave. Most of them never come back." "Leave where?" I asked, but she shook her head. "You don't want to know." I didn't believe her. Not entirely. But there was something in her voice, a weight to her words that made my chest tighten. I looked back at the bell, its surface gleaming faintly in the moonlight. It rang again, and this time, I felt it, not just the sound, but the pull. It was like it was opening a door inside me, one I didn't know existed. And behind that door was something vast and endless, something I couldn't comprehend. I took a step back, then another. The woman watched me, her expression unreadable. "You should leave," she said. "The longer you stay, the harder it'll be." I wanted to argue, to demand answers, but I couldn't. The pull of the bell was still there, faint but insistent, and I knew that if I stayed, I wouldn't be able to resist it. So I left. The next morning, I packed my things and got in my car. The dirt road leading out of town felt longer than it had coming in, the horizon stretching endlessly before me. When I reached the highway, I didn't look back. I don't know what the bell is, or why it calls to people. I don't know what would have happened if I'd touched it, or if I'd stayed. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear it, faint and distant, a low, resonant note that seems to vibrate in my chest. I try to ignore it, but the pull is still there, growing stronger every time. There's an intersection in my neighborhood, not far from the library, where time feels like it hiccups. I'm not talking about a vague sense of déjà vu or the slow drag of a dull day. I mean something real. You're walking, and for a moment, it feels like the world lags, just half a step out of sync. The air is heavier there, like it's pressing against you. And if you listen closely, you'll hear this faint, metallic whine, like the hum of a faraway machine. No one talks about it. If they notice, they keep it to themselves. It's the kind of thing you only mention if you're ready to be laughed at, or worse, believed. I didn't think much of it until the night I saw the woman with the red scarf. I'd been walking home after a late shift at the bookstore, cutting through the quiet streets, my breath fogging in the cold. When I reached the intersection, she was already there, standing in the center like she was waiting for something. Her scarf fluttered in the breeze, though the air felt too still for wind. She didn't move, didn't even glance at me, just stared down the street with a focus so sharp it was unsettling. I hesitated at the curb, debating whether to cross. Something about her presence felt like a warning, though I couldn't explain why. My gut screamed to turn back, to take the long way home, but I stepped into the street anyway, drawn by curiosity or stupidity or both. As I approached, I noticed the faint glow around her, subtle, almost imperceptible, like the light of an old television screen. It seemed to pulse in rhythm with the metallic hum that now vibrated through the air, louder than I'd ever heard it before. "Are you okay?" I asked, my voice cracking in the stillness. She didn't respond. Her head turned slightly, just enough for me to see her profile, and I froze. Her face was wrong. Not disfigured, not monstrous, just wrong. Like it belonged in a different place, a different time. Her features were familiar and unfamiliar all at once, flickering in and out of focus as if they couldn't decide what to be. "Don't," she said suddenly, her voice low and strained. "Don't cross." I stopped, my heart pounding. "What do you mean?" Her eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the world around us seemed to stretch, the streetlights bending like reflections in water. "You don't belong there," she said, each word heavy with urgency. "Not yet." Before I could ask what she meant, a car appeared at the far end of the street, its headlights cutting through the dark. The woman stepped back, her form fading slightly, like she was retreating into the glow that surrounded her. The metallic hum intensified, sharp and grating, and then she was gone. The car passed through the spot where she'd stood, its engine rumbling as if nothing had happened. I stood there, rooted to the pavement, my mind racing. When I finally made it home, I told myself I'd imagined it. The long hours at work, the quiet streets, my own overactive imagination. It had to be nothing. but I couldn't shake the image of her face, the glow, the hum. The next day, I went back. The intersection was empty, just as I'd expected, but something about the air felt different, charged. I walked through it slowly, testing the boundaries, but nothing happened. No hum, no lag, no woman, just an ordinary street. It wasn't until I reached the library steps that I realized the feeling hadn't left me. It clung to my skin, to my thoughts, like static electricity. And as I turned to glance back at the intersection, I saw it. A faint red thread, impossibly thin, stretching from the corner to the door of the library. No one else seemed to notice it. People walked by, cars rolled through the intersection, all oblivious. But the thread glimmered faintly, pulsing in time with a hum that only I could hear. I followed it inside. The library was quiet, the kind of quiet that feels intentional. The thread wound its way through the aisles, leading me deeper into the stacks, past sections I'd never visited before. It finally stopped at a door I didn't recognize, its surface unmarked, its frame slightly crooked as if it didn't quite fit the wall. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. The hum grew louder, vibrating through my chest, and the air around me seemed to ripple faintly. When I opened the door, I expected darkness, or maybe an empty room. Instead, I saw light, blinding, cold, and endless. Shapes moved within it, too fast and too fluid to be human, their outlines shimmering like heat waves. And in the center of it all was the woman with the red scarf. She stood there, her form more solid now, her face sharper and clearer than before. She was holding something, a book, its cover dark and smooth, its pages glowing faintly. When she saw me, her expression shifted, a mix of relief and something I couldn't quite place. "You weren't supposed to find this yet," she said, her voice soft but firm. "I don't understand," I said, stepping into the light despite the fear clawing at my chest. "What is this?" She didn't answer. Instead, she held out the book, her eyes locking onto mine with that same unsettling intensity. "Take it," she said, "and don't lose it." Before I could protest, the light surged, swallowing the room, the shapes, the woman, and then I was back at the intersection. The street was quiet again, the hum gone, the air still. But the book was in my hands, its cover cool against my skin. I haven't opened it yet, not because I don't want to, but because I'm afraid of what I'll find. Afraid that whatever's inside will prove that the intersection wasn't just a glitch in my mind. Afraid it will prove I'm part of something I can't escape. The woman who lived in apartment 5B had a habit of leaving notes under my door. The first one arrived on a Tuesday morning, folded into a neat triangle and smelling faintly of lavender. I was groggy, still clutching my first cup of coffee, when I picked it up and unfolded it. The handwriting was precise, small, and meticulous, the kind of script you'd expect to find in the margins of an old book. "You left your kitchen light on last night. Just thought you'd like to know." There was no signature. I stood there for a moment, the note dangling from my fingers, before glancing toward my kitchen. The light had been on. I remembered it now. I'd been too tired to turn it off when I collapsed into bed. I didn't know much about the woman in 5B. She'd moved in a few months before, but we hadn't exchanged more than polite nods in the hallway. She was quiet, unremarkable, the kind of neighbor who kept to herself. But now, I wondered how she'd noticed my light. Her apartment was across the hall from mine, with no view into my windows. I crumpled the note and tossed it in the trash. The second note came 2 days later. "You forgot to lock your door this morning. I took care of it for you." This time, the words hit me like a slap. I stared at the paper, my pulse thudding in my ears. My door. My lock. How had she known? I checked the lock twice after reading it. It was fine, secure, but the idea that someone had been inside my space made my skin crawl. I told myself it wasn't possible. She'd probably just seen me leave without hearing the click of the lock. She was being neighborly, that was all. Still, I double-checked the lock every time I left after that. The notes didn't stop. "Your houseplant isn't getting enough sunlight. Move it to the south window. Your faucet drips when you're not home. I tightened it for you. You shouldn't keep bread on top of the fridge. It'll mold faster that way." Each note was stranger than the last. not because of what they said, but because of how accurate they were. I did leave my bread on the fridge. My fern had been looking a little limp, and when I turned on the kitchen faucet, I noticed the handle was tighter, the drip mysteriously gone. She was watching me. By the fourth or fifth note, I was too unsettled to let it go. I decided to confront her. Her door was painted the same dull beige as mine, its peephole shiny and blank like a blind eye. I knocked, my knuckles grazing the surface harder than I meant to. Nothing. I waited a few seconds, then knocked again. Still nothing. The hallway was silent, the kind of silence that feels too deliberate, like the building itself was holding its breath. I stood there for a moment longer before turning back toward my apartment. That's when I noticed it. Another note. It was taped to my door this time, the edges curling slightly in the draft. I ripped it down, my hands trembling, and read the words scrawled across the page. "I'm sorry you're upset. Please don't knock on my door again." I stared at the note, my stomach twisting into a knot. She'd known. Somehow, she'd known I was coming to confront her. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. The room was too quiet, every creak and groan of the building amplified in the stillness. My curtains were drawn, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was watching me. The next morning, I found another note. "I didn't mean to scare you. I just want to help." Help. By now, I didn't know what was worse, the fact that she thought this was helpful, or the fact that she clearly knew more about me than anyone had a right to. I considered reporting her, but what could I say? That a neighbor was leaving me passive-aggressive post-its? It wasn't exactly illegal. Still, I started changing my routines. I left my apartment at odd hours, kept the blinds closed, even started walking to a different coffee shop 2 blocks over just to avoid her. It didn't help. The notes kept coming, each one more invasive than the last. "Your phone battery is at 17%. Charge it before you leave. You left the window open in the bathroom. Be careful. It's drafty this time of year. The milk in your fridge expired yesterday. Don't drink it." That was the one that finally broke me. I threw the note on the counter and yanked open the fridge. Sure enough, the carton of milk had expired the day before. I stared at it for a long time, the cool air from the fridge prickling my skin. How could she have known? I called my landlord. He wasn't much help. "She's quiet," he said when I asked about her. "Always pays her rent on time. Never had a complaint about her before." "I'm telling you, she's been in my apartment," I insisted. "Well, unless you've got proof, there's not much I can do." "Sorry." I hung up, my hands shaking. Proof? What kind of proof could I possibly get? That night, I set a trap. I left a piece of tape over the inside of my door, positioned just so. If someone opened it, the tape would tear. I barely slept, my body buzzing with anticipation and dread. In the morning, the tape was still intact. But there was another note. It was folded neatly, sitting on my kitchen counter. I opened it with trembling hands, the words sharp and direct. "The tape won't help. I'm not coming through the door." That was when I noticed the smell. Lavender. Faint, but unmistakable, lingering in the air like a warning. I moved out 2 days later. I didn't leave a forwarding address. Even now, months later, I can't shake the feeling that she's still watching. I've moved cities, changed my phone number, cut off every connection to that apartment building. But every so often, when I wake up in the middle of the night, I think I smell lavender. And when I do, I don't check my door. There's an apartment in my building that's always empty. At least, that's what the landlord says. Unit 6C, directly across the hall from mine. I moved in 3 years ago, and in all that time, I've never seen anyone come or go. No furniture being delivered, no movers carrying boxes, no lights shining from the windows. Just a blank, silent space behind a gray door. At first, I didn't think much of it. Cities are full of weird vacancies. Maybe the landlord was keeping it off the market, or it had some kind of structural issue. But every so often, I'd hear something. A faint sound of footsteps pacing inside. A chair scraping across the floor. Once, I thought I heard a woman laughing softly. When I asked the landlord about it, he shrugged and said, "Probably just the pipes." Then last Tuesday, a note appeared under my door. A single slip of paper, neatly folded in half. When I opened it, the message was written in blocky, uneven handwriting. Stop leaving your window open. It's not safe. I checked the hallway, but no one was there. My window was open, but only a crack. I always left it that way to let in some air. The latch was a bit loose, but it wasn't like anyone could climb in. I live on the 6th floor. Still, something about the note unsettled me. I told myself it was probably a prank, maybe some kid in the building trying to mess with me. But the thought lingered, gnawing at the edge of my mind. That night, I couldn't sleep. The apartment felt too quiet, the shadows in the corners too deep. Around 2 a.m., I heard it again, footsteps in 6C. Not muffled, distant footsteps, like the ones you hear when a neighbor walks around. These were deliberate. Close. I turned off the lamp by my bed and sat in the dark, listening. The footsteps stopped abruptly, replaced by something stranger. A faint rustling, like someone sliding paper under a door. I jumped up and opened mine. Across the hall, the door to 6C stood slightly ajar, just enough to reveal the edge of darkness beyond. A single piece of paper sat on the floor in front of it, identical to the one I'd found earlier. My throat tightened as I stepped forward and picked it up. The message was different this time. Close your curtains. I glanced over my shoulder toward the window. The curtains were open, the city lights spilling into the room. My pulse quickened as I imagined someone out there in the dark, watching me. I pulled the curtains shut, fumbling with the fabric, and turned back to the door. It was closed now, the hallway empty. My chest felt tight, like the air had thickened. I didn't sleep that night. The next day, I tried to act normal. I went to work, came home, made dinner. But the note stayed on my counter. Its words burrowed into my brain. I decided to ask my neighbor down the hall about 6C. Her name was Maya, and we'd exchanged pleasantries a few times in passing. She seemed nice, the kind of person who probably knew more about the building than I did. When I knocked, she opened the door holding a cup of tea, her face curious. "Hey," I said, trying to sound casual. "Have you ever noticed anything weird about 6C?" Her smile faded, replaced by a flicker of something I couldn't quite place. "Weird how?" "I don't know," I said, shifting awkwardly. "Like noises. Or notes." Maya glanced over my shoulder, her expression guarded. "You've been getting notes?" she asked quietly. My heart sank. "So you have to?" She nodded slowly, stepping aside to let me in. Her apartment was cozy, filled with plants and shelves of books. I sat on her couch while she set her tea down on the coffee table. "I've lived here 5 years," she said, sitting across from me. "And I've been getting those notes since I moved in, always from 6C. "What do they say?" I asked. "They're warnings," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. At first, they were small things. Lock your door. Check your peephole. Don't trust the elevator. But then they got stranger, more specific. One told me not to go to work on a particular day. I didn't listen, and I got hit by a car crossing the street. Nothing major, just a broken arm. But it freaked me out. "Do you think someone lives there?" I asked. "Someone watching us?" She shook her head. "I've never seen anyone. I've never even seen the door open. But the notes keep coming." We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her words settling over us like a fog. Finally, I asked, "Do you think they're helping us? Or trying to scare us?" Maya hesitated, her fingers tracing the edge of her mug. "Maybe both," she said finally. "But the scariest part is that they're always right." I didn't want to believe her. I wanted to think it was some elaborate prank, or maybe Maya was just paranoid and imagining connections where there weren't any. But deep down, I knew she was right. The notes weren't random, and whoever, or whatever, was leaving them knew more about us than they should. That night, I found another note. It was on my kitchen counter this time, even though I'd locked the door. "Don't answer the door after midnight." My stomach twisted as I read it. I checked the locks on every window, every door, and sat on the couch with all the lights on, staring at the clock. Midnight came and went, the minutes dragging by like hours. Just when I started to relax, there was a knock. It was soft, almost hesitant, but in the stillness of the apartment, it might as well have been a gunshot. I froze, my heart pounding. Another knock, louder this time. I crept to the peephole, holding my breath. The hallway was empty. The knock came again, and I stumbled back, nearly tripping over the coffee table. My phone was on the couch, but when I reached for it, it buzzed in my hand, the screen lighting up with an unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. "Hello?" I whispered. The line crackled faintly, and a voice spoke, low and distorted, as if coming from far away. "Don't open it." The call disconnected. My entire body was shaking as I put the phone down. The knocking stopped. I didn't sleep that night, or the next. Every sound in the apartment felt magnified. The hum of the refrigerator, the creak of the floorboards, the rustle of the wind against the windows. When I finally stepped outside to leave for work, another note was waiting for me, taped to the inside of my door. "We're almost out of time. I don't know what's in 6C. I don't know if it's a person or something else entirely, but I've stopped asking questions. I keep my windows closed, my curtains drawn, my doors locked. I've started following the notes without hesitation, even when they don't make sense. Because whoever, or whatever, is leaving them isn't just watching. They're waiting. And I don't think I want to find out what happens when they're done." I was walking back from the grocery store, juggling 2 bags of essentials, bread, milk, and the kind of snacks you convince yourself are for emergencies but eat on the same day. The sun was setting, the kind of golden hour that makes the world look like it's been dipped in honey, and I was humming something off-key when I noticed the shoe. It was lying in the gutter, toe pointing upward like it had just been kicked off mid-stride. A man's dress shoe, brown leather, scuffed to hell but still decent enough to suggest it hadn't been there long. I wouldn't have given it a second glance if it weren't for the sock sticking out of it. The sock was rolled neatly, tucked into the shoe in a way that felt deliberate. It was odd. People lose shoes, sure, but who loses a shoe and thinks, "Hey, let me roll up my sock first?" I walked a few steps past it, then stopped. Something about it bugged me. The rolled sock. The way the shoe was perfectly placed, as if someone had left it there on purpose. I glanced around the street. No one was there. The kind of eerie quiet that only exists at twilight, when the world feels caught between one thing and another. Against my better judgment, I put my bags down on the sidewalk and crouched by the shoe. Up close, I could see the leather was cracked in places, the laces frayed, but it wasn't old. It had been worn, sure, but not abandoned for long. I picked it up, and the sock fell out, unraveling slightly on the pavement. That's when I noticed something folded inside the sock. It was a piece of paper, small and square, folded so precisely it reminded me of origami. My first instinct was to leave it alone. Whatever this was, it wasn't mine to mess with. But curiosity, as always, got the better of me. I unfolded it carefully, the paper soft from being crammed inside the sock. Written in shaky, uneven handwriting were 3 words, "Meet me here." That was it. No name, no time, no explanation. Just those 3 words, scrawled in ink that had bled slightly into the paper. I stared at it, my brain working overtime to make sense of it. Was it a prank? Some kind of lost note meant for someone else? But why leave it like this? In a sock, in a shoe, in a gutter? None of it made sense. I stood there for a long time, holding the shoe in one hand and the note in the other, feeling like I'd stumbled into the setup of a very bad joke or a very strange story. Eventually, I put the shoe back where I'd found it, folded the note again, and tucked it into my pocket. I didn't know why I kept it. Something about it felt unfinished, like it wasn't the kind of thing you could just ignore. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about it. The note, the shoe, the way it felt like something left behind deliberately, like a breadcrumb waiting for someone to follow it. By the time I crawled into bed, I'd convinced myself it was nothing, a random coincidence. Just one of those weird little moments life throws at you that doesn't mean anything. But when I woke up the next morning, the note was on my nightstand. I hadn't put it there. I was sure of that. I'd left it in the pocket of my jeans, crumpled up and forgotten. But there it was, perfectly folded, sitting neatly next to my alarm clock. My heart thudded in my chest as I picked it up, unfolding it to make sure it was the same note. It was. Same shaky handwriting. Same 3 words. "Meet me here." I sat on the edge of my bed, staring at it, trying to rationalize how it had gotten there. Maybe I'd moved it myself and forgotten. Maybe I was half asleep and didn't remember, but deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Something about it felt deliberate, like the note had moved itself. The thought sent a shiver through me, but it also did something else. It made me curious. I went back to the street that afternoon, the note tucked in my pocket again, my heart pounding with a mix of fear and excitement. I didn't know what I was expecting to find. Maybe the shoe would still be there. Maybe not. Maybe I'd laugh at myself for even entertaining the idea that this was anything other than a coincidence. But when I got there, the shoe was gone. The spot where it had been was empty, the gutter swept clean by the wind or some unseen hand. I stood there, unsure of what to do, feeling a little ridiculous. Maybe that was it. A dead end. Some weird blip in the universe I'd never fully understand. And then I noticed the chalk. It was faint, almost invisible against the concrete. But once I saw it, I couldn't unsee it. An arrow, drawn in white chalk, pointing toward the alley at the end of the street. My heart started racing again. The logical part of my brain screamed at me to go home, to stop following whatever this was, but the part of me that had kept the note wouldn't let me walk away. I followed the arrow. It led me into the alley, where I found another chalk arrow, this one pointing toward a door I'd never noticed before. It was plain, metal, unmarked. The kind of door that blended into the background, so completely you'd never think twice about it. Next to it, drawn on the wall in more chalk, were two words, "Come in." This was the part where I should have turned around. I know that, but I didn't. Something about it felt inevitable, like I'd already made the decision the moment I picked up the shoe. I reached for the door handle, half expecting it to be locked, but it wasn't. It swung open with a soft creak, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into the dark. I hesitated, my pulse thundering in my ears. This was insane, dangerous, the kind of thing you read about in the news and think, why would anyone do that? But I couldn't stop myself. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The staircase was longer than it should have been, way longer. It felt like I was descending for hours, the air growing colder and heavier with each step. The walls were rough, made of some kind of stone, and the faint sound of dripping water echoed around me. By the time I reached the bottom, my legs were shaking. The room at the end of the staircase was small and bare, lit by a single flickering light bulb hanging from the ceiling. In the center of the room was a table, and on the table was the shoe. The same shoe I'd found in the gutter, its leather scuffed, its laces frayed. Next to it was another piece of paper, folded neatly. I stepped closer, my breath catching in my throat, and picked up the note. This time, the handwriting was different, neat, precise, almost mechanical. The words made my blood run cold. "You're here. Good. Now it begins." Behind me, the door slammed shut. I used to babysit for a family who lived in a sprawling old house at the edge of town. The kind of house with too many doors, not enough light, and a vague sense that it might eat you if you wandered down the wrong hallway. The family, Mark and Diane, and their 6-year-old daughter, June, were nice enough, but the house always gave me the creeps. It wasn't haunted, exactly, but there was something off about it. The air felt heavier inside, and every sound, footsteps, doors creaking, water running, echoed just a little too long, like the house was listening. I only took the job because I was desperate for money, and babysitting seemed safer than working the night shift at the gas station. Mark and Diane were lawyers, the kind of busy, polished people who paid in crisp bills and always left detailed instructions. June was quiet and polite, the kind of kid who colored inside the lines and whispered to her stuffed animals when she thought no one was listening. She wasn't a difficult kid to watch. If anything, she was too quiet. The kind of quiet that made you check in every 5 minutes just to make sure she was still breathing. The first few nights were uneventful. I'd help June with her bedtime routine, bath, pajamas, 2 books, lights out by 8:30, and then spend the rest of the evening sprawled on the couch, eating their fancy snacks and flipping through their endless collection of streaming services. But about 2 weeks in, something strange happened. It was a little after 9, and I was halfway through a bag of kettle corn when I heard it. A soft, rhythmic tapping, like someone gently knocking on a wooden surface. I muted the TV and sat there for a moment, listening. The tapping stopped. I told myself it was just the house settling, unmuted the TV, and went back to my show. Then it happened again. This time, it was louder, and it seemed to be coming from upstairs. I hesitated, every horror movie I'd ever seen flashing through my brain, before finally convincing myself to investigate. I grabbed my phone, because obviously, having a flashlight app makes you invincible, and made my way up the creaky staircase. June's door was closed, and when I peeked inside, she was fast asleep, her small body curled around a stuffed bunny. I checked the other rooms, Mark's home office, the guest bathroom, the master bedroom, but everything was exactly where it should be. No open windows, no weird drafts, no murderers hiding in the closet. I was about to head back downstairs when I noticed something odd. At the far end of the hallway, near the linen closet, there was a door I didn't recognize. I could have sworn it hadn't been there before, but maybe I just missed it. The house was old, full of strange nooks and crannies, and the hallway was dimly lit, so it wasn't entirely impossible. Still, something about the door made my skin crawl. It was smaller than the others, with a tarnished brass knob and peeling white paint that looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. I told myself not to open it. Normal people don't open mysterious doors in creepy old houses. Normal people go back to the couch, finish their kettle corn, and leave the door for the homeowners to deal with. But I wasn't feeling particularly normal that night, so I reached out, turned the knob, and pulled. The door swung open easily, revealing a narrow staircase that spiraled down into darkness. A cold, musty smell wafted up, like damp earth and rotting wood. My first thought was that it must lead to the basement, though I hadn't seen any sign of one on the main floor. The thought of going down there made my stomach twist, but I also couldn't just leave it. What if there was some kind of leak or broken pipe? What if the noise I'd heard earlier was an animal that had gotten trapped? I took a deep breath, turned on my flashlight, and started down the stairs. The air grew colder the deeper I went, and my footsteps echoed oddly, like the space around me was much larger than it should have been. When I reached the bottom, I found myself standing in a long, narrow corridor. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper, and the floor was covered in scuffed tiles that looked out of place in what I assumed was supposed to be a basement. At the far end of the corridor, there was another door. I hesitated, my flashlight trembling slightly in my hand. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to turn around and go back upstairs, but something about the door pulled me forward, like I needed to see what was behind it. I reached out, my hand brushing the cold brass knob, and, Ellie, I nearly dropped my phone. Whipping around, I saw June standing at the bottom of the stairs, her bunny dangling from one hand. Her eyes looked too big in the dim light, and her voice was small and unsteady. "What are you doing down here?" I asked, my own voice shaking. "You're not supposed to open that door," she said softly, her gaze fixed on the one behind me. I swallowed hard. "Why not?" She didn't answer. Instead, she turned and started back up the stairs, her footsteps barely making a sound. I glanced back at the door one last time, a chill running down my spine, before following her. When I got back to her room, she was already in bed, her bunny tucked under her chin. Her breathing was slow and steady, like she'd been asleep for hours. I wanted to wake her, to ask her what she'd been doing in the basement, but something stopped me. Instead, I backed out of the room, closed the door, and sat on the couch until Mark and Diane came home. I never mentioned the basement to them. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to sound crazy, or maybe I was afraid of what they might say. I finished out the summer, but I never went back downstairs, and I never heard the tapping again. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing, but then I remember the cold, musty air, the peeling wallpaper, and the way June's voice sounded when she said, "You're not supposed to open that door." And I wonder what would have happened if I had. So, here's my question. Have you ever come across something, some place, some moment, that felt like it wasn't meant for you? Something that left you with more questions than answers? If you have, I'd love to hear your story. There's this old watch that I keep in a drawer in my desk. It doesn't work anymore, hasn't in years, but I still take it out every now and then, just to hold it in my hands. It's one of those sturdy, utilitarian watches, the kind that looks like it could survive being dropped off a mountain, even though its demise came from something far less dramatic, a botched battery replacement. I could have fixed it, I still could, probably, but I never got around to it, and now it just sits there, frozen at 3:26, like some tiny, personal apocalypse caught mid-blink. I don't know why I've kept it for so long. It's not particularly valuable, and I don't wear watches anymore anyway. My phone has long since taken over the job of keeping me on time, which is ironic, considering I'm late for almost everything. But there's something about this watch. The weight of it, the faint scratches on the glass, the little specks of dirt caught in the grooves of the band, that feels important. It's a thing that was with me, quietly marking hours I've mostly forgotten, and somehow that feels worth holding on to. The funny thing is, I don't even remember when I stopped wearing it. One day, I just took it off and set it on my nightstand, and then it was in a drawer, and then it was just there. Time doesn't really announce itself like that, does it? You don't notice when something changes until long after it already has. One day you're checking your watch every 5 minutes, rushing to make a meeting or a bus or whatever else feels urgent, and then suddenly you're not. And by the time you realize it, the watch is broken, and you're sitting at your desk, holding it like it's some kind of artifact from a life you barely recognize. A few nights ago, I took the watch out of the drawer again. I wasn't looking for it, exactly. It just sort of turned up while I was digging around for a pin. I held it for a while, turning it over in my hands, and then, on a whim, I decided to open it up. I found a tiny screwdriver in the kitchen drawer, the kind you're supposed to use for fixing glasses, and carefully pried off the back. Inside, everything was smaller than I expected. Gears and springs, delicate as spiderwebs, arranged in some impossibly precise order that I couldn't begin to understand. As I stared at the tiny mechanisms, I was hit with this overwhelming sense of inadequacy. Here was this beautiful, intricate thing, something that had once been alive in its own way, ticking and spinning and measuring moments, and now it was broken, and I couldn't fix it. I didn't even know where to start. I closed the watch back up and set it on the desk, feeling like I'd just been handed a riddle with no answer. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the watch. Not just the fact that it was broken, but what it meant that I'd let it stay broken for so long. How many things in my life had I abandoned like that? Not because I didn't care, but because I didn't know how to fix them. Relationships that drifted apart. Plans that got shelved. Projects I never finished because I hit a snag and didn't know how to move forward. The watch was just one of 1,000 little reminders that life doesn't stop when you get stuck. It keeps moving, whether you're ready or not. The next morning, I decided to do something about it. Not the watch. That felt too symbolic, too obvious. But something else. I went out to the garage and dug around until I found the bike I'd stopped riding 2 summers ago. The tires were flat, the chain was stiff with rust, and the whole thing was coated in a fine layer of dust that smelled faintly of mildew. I dragged it out onto the driveway, grabbed a rag and a can of WD-40, and got to work. It took hours. I scrubbed the frame, patched the tires, and fiddled with the chain until it finally moved the way it was supposed to. By the time I was done, my hands were black with grease and my back ached from crouching, but the bike looked decent. Not new, exactly, but functional. I wheeled it out to the street, climbed on, and started pedaling. At first, it felt awkward, like I'd forgotten how to balance, but after a few blocks, my muscles remembered. The wind whipped past my face, and for the first time in what felt like ages, I wasn't thinking about anything. No to-do lists, no broken watches, no nagging questions about whether I was doing enough with my life. Just the rhythmic click of the chain, the hum of the tires on the pavement, and the simple, stupid joy of movement. I didn't go far, just a couple of miles around the neighborhood, but when I got back, I felt lighter. I parked the bike by the garage and went inside, where the watch was still sitting on the desk, right where I'd left it. I picked it up again, turning it over in my hands, and this time, it didn't feel like a reminder of failure. It just felt like a thing, a small, broken thing that didn't need to mean anything more than that. I'm not saying I'll never fix it. Maybe one day I'll find the right tools, or the right person who knows how to coax those tiny gears back to life. Or maybe I won't. Maybe it'll just stay in the drawer, a little memento of all the time I didn't know what to do with. Either way, I think I'm okay with it now. So here's my question for you. What's something you've left broken, not because you didn't care, but because you didn't know how to fix it? And do you think it's ever too late to try? There's a spot in the woods behind my apartment complex that no one seems to talk about. It's not on any map, not mentioned in the usual best local hiking trails blogs, and none of my neighbors have ever brought it up in conversation. But it's there, tucked behind a rusted chain-link fence with a gap just wide enough to slip through. If you weren't paying attention, you'd miss it entirely. I found it by accident last fall, chasing a rogue frisbee during an impromptu game in the park. One minute, I was jogging through the trees, the crisp air biting my cheeks, and the next, I was standing in front of that fence, staring at the opening like it was inviting me in. Beyond the gap, the forest felt different. Not just darker, but quieter, like even the wind wasn't sure it was welcome. Still, something about it pulled at me, so I ducked through the fence and kept walking. It didn't take long to find the clearing. About 100 yards in, the trees gave way to an open space filled with knee-high grass and a scattering of wildflowers, even though it was late enough in the year that most flowers should have been dead. In the center of the clearing stood a small, circular pond, perfectly still, and beside the pond, half sunken into the earth like it had grown there, was a door. Not a shed, not a cabin, just a door. Freestanding, wooden, with peeling green paint and a brass knob. It was tilted slightly to one side, as if it had been there so long the ground beneath it had shifted. The strangest part was that it wasn't attached to anything. No walls, no frame, just the door itself, standing upright like it was holding up the sky. I walked around it several times, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The front looked like any ordinary door you'd find on an old house, complete with a mail slot and a deadbolt. The back, though, was completely blank. Smooth wood, no hinges, no sign that it was ever meant to open in either direction. I touched it, half expecting it to be warm, but it felt like nothing. Not cold, not warm, just there. I wanted to open it, of course. Who wouldn't? But I hesitated. Something about the door felt private, like a diary someone had left unlocked on a table. It wasn't meant for me, or maybe it was, but only if I knew what I was looking for. And I didn't. So I left. I went back the next day, and the day after that. The door was always there, always unchanged, always sitting beside that perfectly still pond like it had been waiting for centuries. I tried to ignore it, to treat the clearing as just another quiet place to think, but the door never stopped pulling at the edge of my mind. I wanted to know where it led, if it led anywhere at all. I wanted to know why it was there. And yet, every time I reached for the knob, I stopped myself, caught between curiosity and the gut feeling that some doors aren't meant to be opened. But then, last week, something changed. When I stepped into the clearing, the door was different. There was a piece of paper taped to it, yellowed and curling at the edges. Written in delicate, looping handwriting were 3 words, "Ask your question." I stared at the note for a long time, my pulse thrumming in my ears. Ask your question. It wasn't signed. It didn't explain anything, but it felt like an invitation, or maybe a challenge. I didn't know what to ask. My mind went blank, and I just stood there, running through possibilities. Should I ask about the door itself? Where it came from? Who put it there? Or should I ask something bigger, something I'd always wanted to know but had never had the chance to ask? The more I thought about it, the harder it became to focus. Every question felt too small or too big or too wrong. Finally, I decided to just ask. I stepped closer, the grass crunching beneath my boots, and rested my hand on the cool brass knob. My heart was racing, but my voice was steady. What am I supposed to do with my life? I said aloud. It wasn't the most original question, but it was honest. I'd been feeling stuck lately, caught in the monotony of work and bills and never-ending to-do lists. I was tired of feeling like I was waiting for something to happen, like life was a hallway I couldn't find the door out of. So that's what I asked. And then I waited. At first, nothing happened. The clearing was as still and silent as ever. But just as I was about to let go of the knob and walk away, I heard it. A click. Faint but distinct, like the sound of a lock turning. The door opened. On the other side, there was no forest, no pond, no clearing, just light. Warm, golden light, the kind that makes you think of autumn afternoons and fireplaces and the way your chest feels when someone hugs you a little tighter than you expected. It wasn't blinding, but it was endless, stretching out as far as I could see. And then, just for a moment, I saw something in the light. A figure, standing far in the distance, too far to make out any details. They didn't wave or move. They just stood there, waiting. For me? For someone else? I don't know. But the sight of them filled me with a strange, impossible certainty. I was exactly where I was supposed to be. I don't remember closing the door. I don't even remember walking back through the woods. All I know is that when I got home, I felt lighter. Not like my problems had disappeared. They were all still there, just as messy and complicated as before, but like I'd been given permission to stop worrying so much about getting everything right. I didn't need all the answers yet. I just needed to keep going. I haven't been back to the clearing since then. I'm not sure I need to. The door is probably still there, waiting for the next person to ask their question, whatever it might be. And maybe one day I'll go back, if I ever have another question that needs asking. But for now, I think I've learned what I needed to. Some doors aren't meant to be feared. They're meant to be opened. So now, I'm curious. If you found a door like that, one that promised an answer to your question, what would you ask? Would you dare to open it? Or would you walk away and let it remain a mystery? The moment I stepped onto the bridge, I felt it. The world was ever so slightly off. Not broken, not dangerous, just tilted. The air was thicker, the sounds of the city muffled, as if the space I had entered wasn't entirely real. On either side of me, the river stretched out like a sheet of black glass, reflecting the faint glow of the lampposts in shimmering lines that rippled with the occasional gust of wind. I'd walked this bridge 100 times before, always on my way home from the late shift, but tonight it didn't feel like the same bridge. Tonight, it felt like I'd taken a step out of my usual orbit and into something that was waiting for me. I blamed it on the hour. It was late enough that the streets were mostly empty, the city's usual rhythm slowed to a hum. The kind of hour where everything feels uncertain, where your thoughts echo louder than the cars passing in the distance. I adjusted the strap of my bag and quickened my pace, my boots striking the concrete with a steady rhythm. I didn't want to linger, but just as I passed the halfway point, I saw it. A door. It was just standing there, in the middle of the bridge, tall and freestanding, with nothing behind it and nothing holding it up. The wood was dark and weathered, its edges warped, the kind of door you might see on an old farmhouse or a crumbling inn in some small town that no one visits anymore. A brass handle gleamed faintly in the light of the nearest lamppost, polished but scratched, as though it had been turned thousands of times. There was no frame, no wall, no reason for it to be there. Just a door, standing in the open air like it had grown out of the concrete. I stopped, my breath catching in my throat. I looked behind me, half expecting someone to be there, someone who could explain what I was seeing. But the bridge was empty, the street beyond it deserted. There were no cars, no footsteps, no sign of life other than the faint ripple of the river below. Just me and the door. My first thought was that it was some kind of art installation. The city loved its weird sculptures, metal trees that hummed in the wind, a bench shaped like a giant shoe, a fountain that only worked when it rained. Maybe this was the latest edition, some avant-garde piece meant to make people stop and think about whatever doors were supposed to symbolize. Opportunity? Mystery? Passage? But it didn't feel like art. It felt like it was there for a reason. For me, I should have walked away. I knew that, even as I took the first step closer. Doors aren't supposed to be in places like this. They're supposed to lead somewhere, to connect one thing to another, not just exist in the middle of a bridge at 3 in the morning. But the closer I got, the more I felt pulled toward it, like a thread inside me was being gently tugged. Not hard enough to drag me, but enough that I couldn't quite resist. I stopped a foot away from it, my pulse thrumming in my ears. Up close, the door looked older than I'd thought. The wood was scarred with deep grooves, the kind you get from years of careless handling, as if someone had dragged it across gravel or slammed it shut too many times. The brass handle was cold when I touched it, colder than it should have been. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the door, wondering what would happen if I turned the knob, wondering if I should. And then it knocked. Not loudly, not sharply, just a soft, deliberate knock. 3 times. I yanked my hand away from the handle and took a step back, my heart lurching in my chest. The sound shouldn't have been possible. There was no one on the other side. I knew that. I had walked past the spot where the door was now standing not 5 minutes ago, and there had been nothing there. But the knock came again, soft but insistent, like whoever, or whatever, was knocking didn't care about logic or explanations. It just wanted me to answer. I glanced around again, searching for anything, anyone, that could make sense of this. But the bridge remained empty, the world beyond it still and silent. I was alone, and the door was waiting. Before I could talk myself out of it, I stepped forward again. My hand trembled as I reached for the handle, gripping it tightly this time. It didn't feel as cold now, but it felt heavier, like the metal had absorbed something from the air around it. Slowly, I turned the knob and pushed the door open. It wasn't a door, or rather, it didn't behave like a door should. There was no other side, no frame to step through, no world waiting beyond it. Instead, the space inside the door was filled with a swirling darkness that moved like smoke but didn't dissipate. It wasn't empty, though. There was something inside it, something shifting and alive. Shapes emerged and disappeared too quickly for me to focus on them. Hands, maybe, or wings, or something else entirely. There were whispers, too, faint and overlapping. 100 voices speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. The sound wasn't coming from the air. It was coming from inside me, resonating in my chest like an echo of something I'd forgotten. I should have been terrified. Maybe I was. But as I stood there, staring into the impossible space inside the door, I felt something else, something deeper. Recognition. Like I'd seen this before, or dreamed it, or carried it with me all my life without knowing. And then, as I leaned closer, the darkness shifted again, and I saw it. A single word, written in the smoke in letters so faint they were almost invisible. Choose. I didn't understand what it meant, not fully. But in that moment, it didn't matter. I reached out, my hand trembling, and touched the darkness. It was warm, almost soothing, like stepping into sunlight after hours in the cold. The whispers grew louder, sharper, and for a moment, I thought I could make out words, fragments of meaning. And then the world tilted again, harder this time, and everything went white. When I opened my eyes, the door was gone. The bridge was the same as it had always been, concrete and lampposts and the faint smell of the river. But the air felt lighter now, clearer, as though a weight I hadn't noticed before had been lifted. I stood there for a long time, staring at the empty space where the door had been, trying to remember exactly what I'd seen. But the details were slipping away, fading like a dream you can't hold onto no matter how hard you try. The only thing I knew for certain was this. Something had changed, not the world, but me. And whatever choice I'd made, I had a feeling I wouldn't fully understand it until it was too late to turn back. I have a habit of falling for people through their handwriting. It's not intentional, and it's certainly not practical. Handwriting doesn't tell you whether someone is kind or emotionally available or even good at parallel parking. But for me, it's like looking into a person's secret interior world, as if the way they loop their G's or angle their T's contains all the hidden mysteries of who they are. I've fallen for strangers over the tilt of their cursive L's, for friends over the way they scribble notes on Post-its. I've even dated someone whose handwriting I barely liked, only to realize, a little too late, that this probably should have been my first clue. The first time I remember noticing it, I was in middle school. We had this big group project where everyone had to contribute to the same giant poster, and my job was to write out the title because I had neat handwriting. It wasn't a compliment, just a logistical assignment. I wrote legibly, which, at 13, made me a unicorn. But when I picked up the marker, the boy sitting next to me, Ethan, started doodling in the corner of the poster. I glanced over, and something about the way he drew his lowercase r's made my brain short-circuit. They were rounded, soft, like they belonged in some storybook about a woodland creature who wore glasses and worked at a tiny forest library. I spent the rest of that group project staring at Ethan's hands as he doodled, a mix of envy and admiration swirling inside me. That crush lasted 6 months, and I'm 80% sure it was based entirely on his handwriting. Since then, It's only gotten weirder. I once went on 3 dates with a guy named Sam simply because he wrote his phone number on a napkin using the most elegant, fluid script I'd ever seen in my life. His J's looked like something you'd see in a museum, carved into marble by some Renaissance artisan. I was so enchanted. I agreed to dinner before I even thought to ask what he did for a living. It turned out Sam was a professional calligrapher. You'd think this would have been a perfect match for someone like me, but honestly, it was too much. Sam's handwriting was so intentional, so practiced, that it started to feel performative. He even wrote me a letter after our second date. Not a text, not an email, but an actual letter on thick, cream-colored stationery. It was gorgeous, sure, but it felt more like something you'd read aloud at a historical reenactment than something meant for a real person. I kept the letter, of course I did, but I never called him back. His handwriting was too perfect, and perfect, I realized, is not what I'm looking for. What I love is the imperfection, the quirks, the messy, human stuff. I once fell hopelessly for a woman named Nadia who wrote in this spiky, chaotic scrawl that looked like it belonged in the margins of some ancient manuscript. Her letters leaned in all directions, like they were constantly on the verge of toppling over. Her S's never quite connected, so they looked more like jagged lightning bolts. It was the kind of handwriting that made you imagine someone furiously scribbling out their thoughts at 3 a.m., their hair wild, their heart racing. Nadia was like that, too. When we first met, she handed me a sticky note with her number on it, and I remember staring at it for an embarrassingly long time before I realized she was waiting for me to respond. "Call me," she said with a smirk, her handwriting practically buzzing off the paper. I never stood a chance. Nadia and I didn't last long. Turns out we were both chaos in different ways, and two storms don't always make a good team. But I still have that sticky note somewhere. I keep a lot of handwriting, actually. Old notes, postcards, scraps of paper with grocery lists or doodles. It's not just a habit, it's a compulsion. I feel like I'm archiving these tiny, intimate pieces of people I've loved, like a curator of a museum no one else will ever visit. Sometimes I pull out the box where I keep them and just look. There's a birthday card from a friend who used to dot her I's with tiny circles. A to-do list from an ex who wrote in blocky, all-caps print that made even the words "by toothpaste" feel like a military directive. A napkin with a scribbled map on it from a stranger who once gave me directions to a farmer's market. Each one feels like a little portal back to a moment I thought was lost. The strangest part, though, is that I never tell people about this. I can't. How do you tell someone? "I've been thinking about you a lot because the way you draw your ampersands makes my stomach flip." Or, "Hey, the way your handwriting leans slightly to the left makes me wonder if you're secretly a poet." It's too much. Too weird. And anyway, I'm not delusional. I know handwriting doesn't actually mean anything. It's not some magical window into a person's soul, but it feels like it is. And isn't that the same thing in the end? Recently, I've been catching myself staring at a post-it that someone left on my desk at work. It's from Maya, who sits 2 cubicles over, and all it says is, "Don't forget about the team meeting at 3. But it's written in this soft, looping style that makes every letter feel like it's about to drift off the page. Her M's swoop upward like they're smiling. Her E's are perfectly rounded, like tiny balloons. Every time I look at it, I feel this quiet little tug in my chest, like her handwriting is calling out to me, saying, "Look closer. There's something here." I don't know if I'll ever tell Maya how much her handwriting affects me. I don't even know if I'll keep the post-it after the meeting, but for now, it's taped to the corner of my monitor. A reminder that people can leave little pieces of themselves behind without even realizing it. Maybe that's what I love about handwriting. It's accidental, unpolished, a thing people do without thinking, and yet, it's so deeply personal, like a fingerprint, or the way someone laughs when they're not holding back. So now I'm wondering, does anyone else notice these kinds of things? Do you fall for little, inconsequential details about people, things they probably don't even realize they're doing? Or am I the only one out here hoarding scraps of paper like some lovesick crow? Beneath the city, under layers of concrete and forgotten tunnels, there was a door no one remembered building. It wasn't marked, nor did it resemble the rusted, industrial doors common to old subway maintenance systems. This one was wood, dark and polished, with a brass knocker shaped like an open hand. There were no hinges, no keyhole, just the door, standing as if it had grown there, and a faint hum in the air around it. Milo discovered it by accident during his lunch break. He wasn't supposed to be wandering the subway tunnels, but he liked the quiet down there. The way the world above seemed to dissolve into the low buzz of the city's hidden heartbeat. He worked in a building 3 floors too crowded, at a job 3 years too dull, and the tunnels gave him space to think, or not think at all. He stumbled on the door while following the faint tracks of an animal. At least, he thought it was an animal. Paw prints, faint and scattered, led to the wall where the door stood. There were no signs of struggle, no trails leading away, just the door. And the prints stopped at its base, as if whatever had made them had walked through it. Milo touched the knocker out of curiosity. It wasn't cold like he expected, but warm, almost alive, and it vibrated faintly under his fingers. Before he could decide whether to use it, the door opened. The air that spilled out wasn't damp or stale like the tunnels. It smelled of pine and frost, sharp and clean, the way the mountains smell on a bitter winter morning. Milo stepped through, instinctively ducking, though the doorframe was tall enough to accommodate him. On the other side was not more tunnel but a forest. The trees were impossibly tall, their branches disappearing into a canopy that blocked out the sky. The ground under his feet wasn't dirt but something softer, springier, like moss or velvet. A light mist curled between the trunks, and the air hummed faintly, the sound of something just outside his perception. He looked back. The door was still there, standing in the middle of the forest like an impossible artifact. The tunnel wasn't visible on the other side. Instead, it showed only more trees. A part of him wanted to step back through and pretend this hadn't happened, but another part, a louder part, urged him forward. The mist thickened as Milo walked, and the forest grew stranger. Trees twisted in shapes that made no sense, their trunks spiraling and their roots weaving intricate patterns across the ground. Flowers glowed faintly, their petals shifting colors as he passed. He couldn't tell how long he'd been walking. Time felt warped here, stretched and knotted. But eventually, he reached a clearing. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, each one as tall as he was. They pulsed faintly with light, a rhythm that matched the hum in the air. At first, Milo thought he was alone, but then he saw her. She sat on one of the stones, her legs crossed and her eyes closed. Her skin shimmered faintly, like the surface of a pond catching the sun. Her hair flowed around her like ink in water, defying gravity. When she opened her eyes, Milo felt the weight of her gaze in his chest, as though she were reading him, cataloging every detail of who he was. "You're late," she said, her voice low and resonant. I didn't know I was coming," Milo stammered. She tilted her head, her expression unreadable. "Few do, but the door chooses, and it chose you." "Chose me for what?" he asked, his voice steadying despite himself. "To answer a question," she said simply. She slid off the stone and stepped closer. The ground didn't crunch or shift under her feet. It accepted her weight like she belonged there. "What question?" Her gaze held his. "Do you wish to leave the world you know?" Milo blinked. "What do you mean? Like, forever?" "That depends on your answer." He opened his mouth to argue, to demand clarification, but the hum in the air grew louder, drowning out his thoughts. Images flooded his mind. His apartment, his desk covered in paperwork, the faces of colleagues whose names he barely remembered. The monotony, the routine, the days blurring into years without change or meaning. And then he saw the forest again, its endless possibility. His throat tightened. "What happens if I say yes?" She smiled faintly, a glimmer of approval, or maybe pity. "Then you'll stay. The forest will give you purpose. Or it will take you. That depends on you." "And if I say no?" Her smile faded. "Then you return through the door, and it will never open for you again. You'll live the life you've always known." Milo's heart pounded. The hum of the forest seemed to echo his thoughts, amplifying his uncertainty. He stared at the stones, their light pulsing like a heartbeat, and then back at the woman, who waited without impatience. Finally, he spoke. "What do you mean? The forest will take me." "Not everyone belongs here," she said softly. "Some fight it. Some refuse to change. The forest has no use for them. And if I don't fight, then it becomes your home." Milo hesitated. The images of his old life returned, sharper this time. The weight of his choices, the inevitability of days spent chasing something he couldn't name. He looked at the forest, at its impossible beauty, and wondered if he could trust it. He took a deep breath. "I'll stay." The woman stepped closer and placed a hand on his chest. Her touch was cold, but it didn't sting. Instead, it seeped into him, a chill that reached his bones and then spread warmth in its wake. "Good," she said. "The forest welcomes you." The hum grew louder, the light of the stones brightening until it consumed everything. Milo closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, the clearing was gone. He stood alone in the forest, but he didn't feel lost. The ground beneath his feet felt steady, the air alive with promise. Somewhere in the distance, he heard the faint rustle of leaves, like a voice calling his name. The forest had chosen him, and Milo had chosen it in return. The invitation arrived in a plain, unmarked envelope, slipped under Ezra's door sometime during the night. The paper was thick and creamy, embossed with a single line of text, "Come and see." No address, no sender, just those 3 words and a date. Tomorrow. Ezra stared at it for a long time, debating whether it was some elaborate prank. He didn't know his neighbors well, and no one had mentioned anything unusual in the building. Still, the message stirred something inside him, a curiosity that itched like a phantom limb. The next evening, as the city's lights buzzed against the dusk, he followed his instinct. The streets were quieter than usual, their usual pulse subdued. The slip of paper in his pocket felt heavier with each step. He turned down an alley he didn't remember noticing before and found himself in front of a nondescript door painted in chipped green. Above it, a single bulb flickered weakly. No one else was around. Ezra hesitated, then knocked. The door opened soundlessly, revealing a narrow corridor lit by hanging lanterns. The air inside was warmer, carrying the faint scent of cedar and something sweet. He stepped through, the door closing behind him with an audible click. The hallway spilled into a large, circular room that felt much bigger than the building it was housed in. The walls were lined with shelves filled with jars, trinkets, and curiosities, each one more bizarre than the last. A glowing feather, a clock that ticked backward, a jar of swirling black smoke. At the room's center was a table, and behind it sat a figure cloaked in shadow. "Ezra," the figure said, its voice soft but resonant, like the plucking of a cello string. "Welcome. How do you know my name?" Ezra asked, his voice more uncertain than he'd intended. The figure leaned forward, and for a moment, Ezra thought he saw a glint of eyes beneath the hood. "You were invited because you carry a question that has consumed you, and tonight, you will find its answer." Ezra's chest tightened. He hadn't told anyone about the sleepless nights, the questions that clawed at his mind, questions about his father's disappearance, about the dreams that felt more like warnings than nonsense. "What are you talking about?" he asked. The figure gestured toward the shelves. "Here, we trade curiosities for truths. A fragment of yourself for a fragment of the universe." Ezra's pulse quickened. "And if I don't want to trade?" "You leave," the figure said simply. "The door remains open until you step through. But once you take an answer, the exchange is binding." Ezra's eyes scanned the shelves, drawn to a jar on the middle row. Inside, a memory shimmered, a faded scene of a man in a gray coat standing in a field of tall grass. His father. He recognized the way the man tilted his head, the stoop of his shoulders. "I want that one," Ezra said, pointing. The figure's hand extended toward the jar, long and elegant, fingers wrapped in silver rings. It plucked the jar from the shelf and set it on the table. The memory inside glowed brighter, pulsing faintly like a heartbeat. "The cost," the figure said, "is your favorite sound." Ezra blinked, taken aback. "What does that mean?" "A fragment for a fragment," the figure replied. "You will no longer hear the sound that brings you the greatest peace. Its absence will be yours to carry." Ezra thought of the soft rustle of leaves in autumn, the sound that always reminded him of childhood walks with his mother. Could he give that up? He glanced at the jar again, at the image of his father frozen in time. "Fine," he said, his voice cracking. "Take it." The figure nodded, and a rush of warmth swept through Ezra, starting at his ears and spilling down his spine. It wasn't painful, but it was disorienting, like stepping into a room where something essential had been removed. The figure slid the jar toward him, and as Ezra touched it, the memory bloomed in his mind. The field, the gray coat, his father standing beneath a bruised sky. He could hear the man's voice faintly, not much time left. Then the memory faded, leaving only a longing that felt hollow and sharp. "What does it mean?" Ezra asked, clutching the jar. "The answer is yours to interpret," the figure said. "Truth is rarely kind, and clarity is never free." Ezra wanted to argue, to demand more, but the air in the room shifted. The shelves blurred, the lanterns dimmed, and the figure's form seemed to dissolve. He turned back toward the door, jar in hand, and stepped outside. The alley was empty. The door behind him was gone. In the days that followed, Ezra tried to piece together the meaning of the memory. The field in the vision was unfamiliar, the sky unnaturally dark. He scoured maps, searching for landscapes that matched, but the answers remained elusive. And yet, the cost of his exchange was undeniable. He no longer heard the rustling of leaves. The world felt quieter, lonelier. One day, as he walked through a park, the wind stirred the trees above him, their branches shifting in a rhythm he could see but not hear. He closed his eyes, trying to remember the sound, but it was like chasing the outline of a dream. In the silence, though, he thought he caught something else, a whisper, faint but unmistakable, pulling him toward the edge of the park where the trees grew denser, their shadows deeper. He followed. "I first noticed the door when I was 11. It wasn't there before, not in the way a door should be. It wasn't cut into the wall or part of the house's original plan. It just appeared one afternoon, tucked into the far corner of the basement, behind the shelves where my dad kept his old tools and the glass jars filled with screws and nails. The basement wasn't a place I spent much time. It was dark and damp, with concrete floors that made everything sound sharper than it should have. My mom called it unfinished, which was her way of making it seem temporary, like one day it would magically become a cozy den or a playroom. But it never did. That afternoon, I'd gone down to look for a hammer. My dad had told me where to find it. Bottom shelf, blue handle, but it wasn't there. I was crouched down, peering through the clutter, when I saw it. The door was small, no taller than 4 feet, and made of dark wood that looked far too old to belong in a house like ours. The grain was rough, scarred with deep grooves that reminded me of claw marks, though I told myself they weren't. There was no knob, only a brass keyhole set into a tarnished plate. I didn't touch it, not that first time. Instead, I backed away, my hands shaking for reasons I couldn't explain. I told my dad later, over dinner, but he just laughed and said there was no door in the basement. "Probably just an old cabinet," he said, his fork scraping against his plate. "Your imagination's running wild again." I didn't argue, but the next day, I went back. The door was still there. It hadn't changed, but it felt different. Closer, somehow, though I hadn't moved anything around it. I crouched in front of it, running my fingers along the grooves in the wood. The surface was warm, almost pulsing, like something alive. That's when I noticed the key. It was sitting on the floor, just a few inches away from the door, as if someone had placed it there for me. It was small and ornate, with an intricate pattern of swirls carved into its bow. The metal was dull, but it felt heavy in my hand. I should have left it there. I should have gone upstairs, closed the basement door, and never gone back. But I didn't. I held the key for a long time, staring at the door. My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear the faint creak of the house settling above me. And then, before I could talk myself out of it, I slid the key into the lock. It turned with a soft, satisfying click. The door opened inward, revealing only darkness. Not the kind of darkness you get when you close your eyes, or when the lights go out during a storm. This was deeper, heavier, like it wasn't just an absence of light, but the presence of something else. something vast and unknowable. I hesitated, leaning forward to peer into the void. I couldn't see anything, but I felt it, a faint pull, like gravity but stranger. And then I heard the whisper. It wasn't a voice, not exactly. It was more like a thought that wasn't mine, pressing itself into my mind. It was soft at first, almost gentle, but the longer I listened, the more insistent it became. Come in. I didn't move. My hand tightened around the edge of the door, the wood still warm under my fingers. Come in. It wasn't a command, not quite. It was an invitation. I don't remember making the decision to step forward. One moment, I was standing in the basement, and the next, I was inside the door. The darkness swallowed me whole, wrapping itself around me like a thick, suffocating blanket. I couldn't see, couldn't hear, couldn't feel the ground beneath my feet. For a moment, I thought I was floating, untethered from everything I'd ever known. And then the light came. It was faint at first, a soft glow in the distance, but it grew stronger as I moved closer. It wasn't white, like sunlight or a flashlight beam. It was golden, warm, and liquid, spilling out in slow, rippling waves. The room, if you could call it that, was impossibly large. The walls were far away, if they existed at all, and the ceiling stretched so high I couldn't see it. In the center of the space was a table, and on the table was a book. It was huge, its leather cover cracked and faded with age. The edges of the pages glowed faintly, the same golden light that filled the room. I stepped closer, my footsteps silent against the strange, glowing floor. The book wasn't blank. Each page was covered in tiny, handwritten script, the letters looping and curling in a language I didn't recognize. I ran my fingers over the text, the ink warm to the touch. And then, as I watched, the words began to shift. They twisted and reformed, rearranging themselves into shapes I could understand. A name appeared at the top of the page, my name. Below it was a list, written in neat, flowing script. 1. Found the bird with the broken wing. 2. Lied to Mrs. Callahan about the vase. 3. Looked at the stars and wondered. It went on like that, a record of moments I'd thought were forgotten. Some of them were so small I barely remembered them. A single kindness, a fleeting thought, a stolen piece of candy. Others were larger, heavier, things I hadn't told anyone. At the bottom of the page, there was a single line, written in bold, black ink. What will you choose next? The book was asking me a question. Before I could think, before I could stop myself, I reached for the pen that sat beside the book. It was long and silver, cool against my fingers. The moment the tip touched the page, I felt it, a surge of warmth and light, like a thread connecting me to something far greater than myself. I wrote a single word. The pen moved on its own after that, the ink spilling across the page in loops and swirls. My hand was steady, even as my heart raced. When I was done, the ink faded, sinking into the page as though it had always been there. And then the book closed. The golden light dimmed, the darkness creeping back in. I stepped away, my breath catching in my throat, and before I knew it, I was standing in the basement again. The door was gone. I still don't know what I wrote that day, or what it meant, but sometimes, late at night, I feel it. The same pull, the same whisper, like a thread tugging at the edges of my mind. And every time I do, I wonder, was it a choice, or was it already written? I never thought a laundromat at midnight could feel sacred, but there I was, barefoot, staring at a single, crumpled sock like it was some kind of holy relic. The sock wasn't mine. That much was clear from the cartoon dinosaur printed on it, a cheerful green T-Rex riding a skateboard. I didn't own socks with personality, let alone dinosaurs doing tricks. But there it was, damp and forlorn, half stuffed into the corner of a dryer I hadn't even used. I hadn't planned to be at the laundromat so late, but my washing machine at home had finally given up the ghost after a symphony of metallic shrieks and one particularly dramatic puff of black smoke. I loaded a week's worth of laundry into my car, drove to the 24-hour laundromat on the edge of town, and settled in for what I thought would be the most uneventful 2 hours of my week. That sock, though, it was like it wanted something. Like it wasn't just forgotten or misplaced, but waiting. I told myself to ignore it. Stranger things have been left in laundromats. single shoes, deflated basketballs, a torn prom dress once, which I didn't even want to think about. A lone sock was nothing, and yet I couldn't stop glancing at it as I folded my towels and stacked my shirts into neat piles. It's funny, the things your brain decides to focus on when you're tired and the world feels quiet enough to hear your own thoughts. That sock became a puzzle, then a story, then something I couldn't walk away from. Who had left it behind? Was there a kid somewhere out there right now, wondering where his skateboarding dinosaur had gone? Or had it been dropped carelessly by someone who wouldn't even notice it was missing? Eventually, I gave in. I picked it up. It was damp, probably fresh out of the dryer, but clean, at least. As I held it, I noticed something I hadn't seen before. The name, Kyle, scrawled in black marker along the inside of the cuff, the handwriting jagged and uneven, like a kid had written it themselves. Kyle, I said out loud, as if speaking the name would summon him. The laundromat didn't answer. The only sound was the low hum of the remaining dryers, spinning endlessly. The sock hung limp in my hand, its little dinosaur frozen mid-ollie. I didn't know what to do with it. Throwing it away felt wrong, but so did leaving it behind. So, I stuffed it in my pocket and finished folding my laundry, trying to ignore the strange weight it seemed to carry. The drive home was uneventful, but when I unloaded my laundry, I found the sock sitting on top of the pile in the basket. I stopped cold. I knew I'd stuffed it in my pocket. I'd felt it there. And yet, there it was, lying on my clean sheets like it had made itself comfortable. For reasons I couldn't explain, I left it there. I put my laundry away, climbed into bed, and tried not to think about it. That night, I dreamed of a skateboarding dinosaur. It sounds ridiculous, I know, but the dream felt real. Too real. I was standing in a park I didn't recognize, the grass too green, the sky too blue, the air heavy with the smell of something sweet and sharp, like oranges and gasoline. A dinosaur, green, with a cartoonishly large head, zipped past me on a skateboard, leaving a trail of sparks on the pavement. On its back was a boy, no older than 9, clutching the dinosaur's neck and laughing so hard I could hear it echo in my chest. I woke up with the name, Kyle, still on my lips. The sock was on my nightstand. I stared at it for a long time, the dream replaying in my head like a movie I couldn't pause. The smell of oranges and gasoline still lingered faintly in my nose, though there was no reason it should. That day, I did something I hadn't done in years. I went to the library. I wasn't even sure what I was looking for, but I had a feeling, and feelings are dangerous things to ignore. I asked the librarian if there were any missing persons cases involving a kid named Kyle. She gave me a strange look, but indulged me, tapping away at her computer before pointing me toward a microfilm machine in the back. I found it on the 4th reel. 10 years ago, a boy named Kyle Benson went missing from a park 3 towns over. He was last seen playing with his skateboard, wearing a pair of socks with skateboarding dinosaurs on them. The article included a picture of him, freckles, messy hair, and a gap-toothed grin that made my chest ache. I sat there for a long time, staring at the image until it blurred. I don't know why the sock found me, or what it wanted. I don't know what connection, if any, I'm supposed to have to Kyle Benson, but I still have the sock. It sits in my drawer, tucked between my own plain, unremarkable pairs, and every now and then, I take it out and hold it, tracing the jagged black letters of his name. And sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still hear the sound of wheels on pavement and the faint, impossible laughter of a boy riding a dinosaur through a park that doesn't exist. Have you ever felt like something small, something insignificant, was put in your life for a reason you couldn't quite explain? Something that refuses to let you forget it, no matter how much time passes. Last week, I found myself locked in an existential crisis over a plastic grocery bag. Not because it tore when I least expected it, spilling my carefully balanced stack of oranges onto the driveway. No, that would have been too easy. Instead, it was because of the way it landed, perfectly inflated, caught in the wind, and flapping against the fence like it had somewhere important to be. For a split second, it looked almost alive, like it was trying to escape. I stood there, oranges rolling away and car keys still dangling in my hand, and all I could think was, where do bags go when we don't stop them? I eventually caught it, wrestling it down like some kind of cheap, translucent jellyfish, and shoved it into my back pocket. But the thought stuck with me. Bags like this aren't supposed to have personalities, but this one did. It had ambition. It had dreams. And it would have gotten away too, if the fence hadn't stopped it. The absurdity of it made me laugh. But later that night, as I sat in my living room with my freshly washed oranges, I couldn't shake the image of the bag floating off into the distance, free and unburdened. The next day, I noticed bags everywhere. They were caught in tree branches like strange, half-deflated balloons. They clung to sidewalks, flat and lifeless, like some long-forgotten message in a bottle that had lost its sea. At one point, I saw one soaring high above the street, completely untethered. For a moment, I envied it. There was something beautiful about its aimlessness. No purpose, no destination, just movement for the sake of movement. I thought about my own life, so packed with routines and plans and obligations, and wondered what it would feel like to float for a while, directionless but free. By the time I got home, the plastic bag from the day before was still sitting on my counter where I'd left it. I picked it up and held it in my hands, half expecting it to wriggle away. It didn't. It just sat there, crinkling faintly. And then, because I was already too far gone into whatever strange headspace this bag had sent me spiraling into, I decided to do something I hadn't done since I was a kid. I made it into a parachute. I tied strings to each corner of the bag and attached the other ends to a little figurine I found on my bookshelf, a ceramic penguin I'd gotten from a souvenir shop years ago. It wasn't aerodynamic, but I didn't care. I opened my window, leaned out into the cool evening air, and let it go. For a moment, the parachute worked. The penguin floated gently downward, carried by the breeze. But then the wind shifted, and the bag buckled, sending the penguin tumbling unceremoniously into the bushes below. I couldn't stop laughing. It was the kind of laughter that comes out of nowhere, bubbling up like you've hit some secret reservoir of joy you didn't know was there. I laughed until my cheeks hurt, until my neighbor glanced up at my window with a look that clearly said, "Should I call someone?" When I finally caught my breath, I climbed down to retrieve the penguin in the bag. The penguin was fine. Ceramic is sturdier than you think, but the bag was torn. Its brief stint as a parachute had been too much for it. I almost threw it away right then and there, but something stopped me. This bag, ridiculous as it was, had sparked something in me I hadn't felt in a long time. Playfulness, curiosity, wonder at the utterly mundane. It felt wrong to toss it into the trash, like it was just another piece of garbage. So instead, I folded it up neatly and slid it into the drawer where I keep all the other plastic bags I've promised myself I'll reuse someday. I knew it wouldn't stay there forever. One day I'd pull it out to line a trash bin or carry a lunch, but for now, it felt like it had earned its place. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to the other small, overlooked things in my life. The rubber band ball on my desk, which had grown to the size of a grapefruit without me even noticing. The tiny chip in my favorite coffee mug that I always absent-mindedly trace with my thumb. Even the loose thread on the cuff of my sweater, which I'd been meaning to snip for weeks but hadn't yet bothered to. These things had been quietly existing in the background, and I'd barely noticed them. But now, they felt alive in a way I couldn't quite explain. I think what struck me most was how much of life happens in the margins. It's not the big, dramatic moments that stick with you. It's the tiny ones, the ones you don't even realize are happening until they've passed. Like the way the light catches the dust motes in the air just before sunset, or the sound of a stranger humming to themselves as they walk by, or a plastic bag caught in the wind, flapping against a fence like it's trying to escape. I don't know why that bag hit me the way it did. Maybe I'd just been in my head too much, weighed down by everything I thought I needed to be doing, and the bag was a reminder to let go. Or maybe it was something simpler, a chance to laugh at myself, to remember that not everything has to have a purpose. Sometimes things just are. The next time I went grocery shopping, the cashier asked if I wanted my items bagged. "Sure," I said, and she handed me a crisp, clean plastic bag. As I walked out to my car, I thought about letting it go, watching it float up and away until it disappeared. But then I thought about my oranges, carefully packed at the bottom of my cart, and decided to hold on to it. After all, there's something to be said for staying grounded, at least until the next breeze comes along. So now I'm curious. Has anything completely ordinary ever stopped you in your tracks and made you see the world differently, even just for a moment? Something small and ridiculous, but strangely profound? Or is it just me and my overactive imagination chasing after plastic bags? The day my neighbor knocked on my door and handed me a cardboard box filled with bees, I knew my life was about to get weird. To be fair, she didn't exactly say, "Here's a box of bees." What she said was, "Hey, I need you to take care of this for a while," before shoving the box into my hands and disappearing down the hallway without further explanation. The box hummed. Not metaphorically like, oh, it had a mysterious vibe. No, it literally hummed. A low, buzzing vibration that made my palms tingle and set every nerve in my body on edge. The kind of sound that says, "Do not shake me unless you enjoy chaos." I should have put it down. I should have opened the door, called after her, demanded some sort of clarification, but instead, I stood there in the middle of my living room, holding the box like it was an unexpected baby someone had just left on my doorstep. The box wasn't sealed, but it was taped up along the edges, with little air holes punched into the top. Someone had scrawled, "Live Cargo," in bright red marker across one side, as if that explained everything. I said out loud, to no one in particular, "Hello?" The box vibrated more aggressively, as if it was annoyed with me. Against my better judgment, I carried it to the kitchen counter and set it down gently. The buzzing intensified. I imagined the bees, or whatever was inside, huddling together, whispering to each other in tiny bee voices, plotting their escape. It took me a full minute to work up the courage to peel back the tape. The moment the box opened, a single bee shot out and hovered in front of my face, wings beating so fast they were nothing but a blur. I froze, expecting it to do what bees usually do. Sting, buzz angrily, maybe fly in frantic loops before finding its way to a window. But this bee didn't do any of that. Finally, it said, in a voice that was surprisingly deep for such a tiny creature, "Took you long enough." I blinked. "What?" The bee rubbed its front legs together impatiently. "You heard me. We've been in that box for hours. Do you have any idea how stuffy it gets in there?" "No," I said, still reeling from the fact that a bee was speaking to me. "No, I don't, because I'm not a bee." Clearly, the bee said, as if my humanity was a personal disappointment to it. "But you're the keeper now, so get over it." "The what?" "The keeper," it repeated, landing delicately on the edge of the box. "Of the hive. Of us. You know, bees." I stared at it, half expecting someone to jump out from behind the couch with a hidden camera and yell, "Gotcha!" But no one did. The bee continued to stare back at me with what I could only describe as exasperated patience. "I think there's been a mistake," I said finally. "There hasn't," the bee said. "This is how it works. The last keeper, what's her name, your neighbor, gave us to you. It's a chain of command situation. One keeper to the next. Congratulations. You're hired." "Okay, but I didn't sign up for this," I said, gesturing wildly at the box. "That's how it works," the bee repeated, as if I were a particularly dense student in a class it didn't want to teach. "You don't choose the bees. The bees choose you." "Why?" "Because," it said simply, and then, as if to hammer home its point, it flew back into the box, leaving me alone with the buzzing horde. For the next hour, I sat on the kitchen floor, staring at the box, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The rational part of my brain kept saying, "This is ridiculous. Bees don't talk." But another, quieter part, the part that had always believed in strange things, even if it didn't like to admit it, was starting to wonder if maybe this was real. The bees didn't seem inclined to offer further explanations. Every time I peeked into the box, they buzzed louder, as if to say, "Privacy, please." By the time night fell, I had come to 3 conclusions. 1. My neighbor was never going to explain herself. 2. The bees weren't leaving. 3. I had no idea how to take care of a hive. The next morning, I woke up to find the bees had escaped the box. They weren't swarming around the apartment, though. That's what I'd expected. Chaos, stingers, my landlord banging on the door to evict me for harboring an insect army. But instead, They'd organized themselves into neat little clusters. There was a group lounging on the windowsill, soaking up the sunlight. Another group hovered around my coffee maker, apparently fascinated by its dripping mechanisms. One particularly bold bee was perched on my toothbrush, glaring at me as if daring me to ask it to move. And in the middle of it all was the same bee from yesterday, sitting smugly on the edge of my laptop. "Morning, keeper," it said, stretching its tiny legs like it was settling in for a long conversation. "Sleep well?" "No," I said flatly. "There are bees in my apartment." "Yes," the bee said. "That's the point. What do you want from me?" I asked, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. "Not much," the bee replied. "Just the basics. Shelter, respect, occasional snacks. And in return, we'll keep an eye on things." "What things?" "You'll see," it said cryptically. I spent the rest of the day tiptoeing around the apartment, trying not to squash any of my new tenants. The bees, for their part, seemed surprisingly chill about the whole arrangement. They didn't sting me. They didn't swarm me. They just coexisted. That night, as I was brushing my teeth, with a fresh toothbrush I'd bought on the way home, the bee perched on the mirror spoke up again. "You'll get the hang of it," it said, its tone almost reassuring. "The hang of what?" I asked through a mouthful of toothpaste. "Being the keeper," it said simply. "You're one of us now." I don't know what that means yet, but I haven't seen a single cockroach in the apartment since the bees arrived, and I'm starting to think they're onto something. Would you keep the bees? Or would you run screaming? Because honestly, I think I'm starting to like them. I found the note in the pocket of a coat I didn't own. It was an ordinary Tuesday, or as close to ordinary as things get these days, and I'd just come home from work, dragging my usual baggage of mild exhaustion and a half-empty coffee thermos. The coat was hanging by the door, perfectly pressed and unfamiliar, a deep charcoal gray with buttons that gleamed faintly in the dim light of my apartment. I stopped mid-step, staring at it. I didn't own a gray coat. I don't even like gray. At first, I thought maybe I'd forgotten something. Maybe I bought it during one of those late-night online shopping sessions, the ones where insomnia whispers that what you really need in your life is more jackets, kitchen gadgets, and novelty socks. But the coat was too nice, nicer than anything I'd ever buy for myself. The fabric felt heavy, almost old-fashioned, and the lining was a deep wine red, embroidered with swirling patterns I didn't recognize. I hesitated, then reached into the pocket. That's where I found the note. The paper was thick, almost waxy, like it belonged in an antique stationery set. The handwriting was precise, looping, and far too elegant for something hastily scribbled. It read, "You're late. 3rd floor. Room 305. No name, no explanation." I stared at the note, then at the coat, half expecting it to vanish like some magician's trick. But it didn't. It stayed there, solid and real, as though it had every right to exist in my entryway. Now, I'm not the kind of person who gets involved in mysteries. I've read enough books and watched enough movies to know how that ends. With you stumbling into something much bigger and weirder than you ever wanted, and probably getting chased by a shadowy organization or cursed by an ancient artifact. But the coat felt like it was waiting. I don't know how to explain it. There was this quiet pressure in the room, like the coat was holding its breath. "Fine," I muttered, slipping it on. It fit perfectly, of course. The address came to me without thinking, even though I'd never seen the note before in my life. I knew exactly where room 305 was, like the words had planted themselves directly into my brain. It was in an old office building downtown, one of those places you don't notice unless you're looking for it. The ride there felt strange, like the world was tilting slightly out of focus. The city seemed too still. Cars passed, lights blinked, people walked by, but everything felt muted, as though I was watching a recording that didn't quite line up with reality. When I reached the building, I half expected it to be locked or abandoned, but the door opened easily. The lobby smelled faintly of lemon polish and something metallic, and the air felt heavy, like it was charged with static electricity. The elevator ride to the 3rd floor was oddly smooth, the kind of smooth where you wonder if the elevator is moving at all. When the doors opened, I stepped into a narrow hallway lined with doors, each one painted a deep, glossy black. The numbers were etched into small brass plates, polished to a mirror shine. Room 305 was at the far end of the hall. The door was already open. Inside, the room was smaller than I'd expected, lit by a single bulb that cast sharp shadows against the walls. A man stood by the window, his back to me, wearing a coat identical to the one I'd found. His silhouette was long and lean, and there was something unsettlingly precise about the way he stood, as if he were perfectly balanced on some invisible axis. "You came," he said, without turning around. "Should I not have?" I asked, clutching the note in my pocket. He chuckled softly, a sound that didn't reach his voice. "You always do. It's part of the arrangement." I frowned. "What arrangement? I don't even know who you are." Finally, he turned. His face was sharp and pale, almost too symmetrical, with eyes that seemed to catch the light in a way that wasn't quite natural. He didn't look old, but there was something ancient about him, like he'd been waiting in this room for far too long. "You don't remember," he said, and there was a flicker of something in his expression. Pity, maybe, or amusement. "Remember what?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted the answer. He gestured to the coat I was wearing. "That's not yours." "Yeah, I figured that part out," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "So whose is it?" "Yours," he said simply. "From a different time. A different version of you. The one that made a deal." "A deal for what?" "For a choice," he said. "A single moment. You traded it for something you thought was more important." I shook my head. "You're not making any sense." "You will," he said, stepping closer. His eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, it felt like the entire room shifted, tilting under the weight of something vast and unseen. "Do you want it back?" The words hit me like a punch to the chest. I didn't know what he was talking about, not exactly, but I felt the weight of it, heavy and real. There was something missing, something I'd lost without even realizing it, and now it was dangling just out of reach. "What happens if I say yes?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He smiled, a sharp, too perfect smile. "You get it back. The choice. The chance to change everything. And if I say no? Then you walk out of here, and none of this will matter. You'll forget the coat, the note, this room. You'll go back to your life." The air felt thick, suffocating. The idea of leaving felt wrong, like walking away from a locked door you know is hiding something important. But the idea of staying felt even worse, like stepping into a room with no exit. "I don't even know what I traded," I said. "You don't have to," he replied. "You just have to decide." The room seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I took a step forward, then another, and I made my choice. There's a building at the edge of town that everyone seems to forget about. It's one of those places you can pass 100 times without ever really seeing it. Maybe it's the faded brick facade, or the way the windows reflect the sky so perfectly they almost disappear, like the glass isn't even there. Or maybe it's the way the whole structure seems to blend into the background, like it's hiding in plain sight. I don't know. All I know is that one evening, while waiting for a bus that never came, I finally noticed it. The front door was painted a dull red and looked warped, as if it had been rained on for decades. Above the door, there was a weathered plaque that read, "Office of Lost and Found." The name was so absurdly vague that I almost laughed out loud. What kind of business calls itself that? Lost and found what? Keys? Umbrellas? Dogs? The sign had no logo, no hours of operation, just those 3 words etched in metal and worn smooth by time. I don't know why I did it. Maybe I was bored, maybe I was curious, or maybe it was the way the streetlights flickered in that particular moment, as if daring me to go inside. Whatever the reason, I pushed open the warped door and stepped into the strangest place I've ever seen. The room smelled like old paper and warm dust, the kind of smell that makes you think of libraries or antique shops. Shelves lined the walls, stretching up to a ceiling that seemed far too high for the size of the building. Each shelf was packed with objects, but not in the cluttered, chaotic way you'd expect. Everything was meticulously arranged. A glass jar filled with marbles sat next to a single leather glove. A pair of glasses missing one lens rested atop a thick book with no title. There was a row of mismatched shoes, a collection of keys on a silver tray, and, inexplicably, a violin missing all its strings. Behind the counter stood a man wearing a vest and bow tie, the kind of outfit that made him look like he belonged in another century. His face was thin and sharp, his hair gray at the temples but neatly combed, and he had a pair of wire-rimmed glasses perched on his nose. He was flipping through a large ledger, his long fingers trailing over the pages as if searching for something. When he looked up and saw me, he smiled. But it wasn't the kind of smile you get from a shopkeeper welcoming a new customer. It was a knowing smile, like he'd been expecting me. "Good evening," he said, his voice calm and deliberate. "What have you lost?" The question caught me off guard. What have you lost?" he repeated, setting the ledger down and folding his hands on the counter. "We specialize in finding things that have been misplaced, forgotten, or left behind." I almost laughed. "I didn't lose anything. Are you sure?" He tilted his head, studying me like he could see straight through my skin. "People don't usually come in here unless they've lost something important." I opened my mouth to argue, but the words got stuck. I was sure I hadn't lost anything, or at least, I thought I was sure. But there was something about the way he looked at me, something that made me hesitate. My mind raced through the usual suspects: wallet, phone, keys, all accounted for. But then I thought about the things you can't hold in your hands, the people you don't call anymore, the plans you gave up on, the versions of yourself you've let slip away. "I don't know," I admitted finally. "Maybe." He nodded, as if this answer satisfied him. "Well, why don't we take a look?" He stepped out from behind the counter and gestured for me to follow him into the back of the shop. I hesitated for a moment. What was I even doing here? But something about the place made it hard to leave. It wasn't just the curiosity anymore. It was something deeper, like the air itself was holding me there. The back room was even stranger than the front. The shelves were taller, the items more eclectic. I saw a row of Polaroid photos pinned to a corkboard, each one showing a different face. A cracked pocket watch sat on a pedestal, its hands spinning backward at a steady pace. There was an entire cabinet filled with small bottles, each labeled with phrases like "a summer afternoon" or "the sound of laughter." He stopped in front of a tall, narrow shelf and reached for something on the top. His hand came down holding an old shoebox, the cardboard soft and worn at the edges. He set it on a nearby table and opened the lid. Inside was a photo of me, but not the me I am now. It was me from years ago, back when I still wore mismatched socks and thought the world was full of endless possibilities. In the photo, I was holding a guitar I'd sold years ago, smiling in a way I didn't recognize anymore. Beside the photo was a handful of ticket stubs, a bracelet made of braided string, and a small notebook filled with doodles and half-finished ideas. I stared at the contents, my chest tightening with a feeling I couldn't name. "I don't understand," I said. "Where did you get this?" "You left it behind," the man said simply. "Not all at once, of course. Piece by piece. Some things we lose on purpose. Others just slip away." I ran my fingers over the edge of the photo, my mind racing. These weren't just things. They were pieces of a person I barely remembered being, fragments of dreams and feelings I hadn't thought about in years. I didn't even realize I'd lost them until now. "Can I take it?" I asked, my voice quieter than I intended. He smiled again, that same knowing smile. "It's already yours." I left the shop clutching the shoebox like it was made of glass. When I got home, I spent hours going through its contents, turning each item over in my hands, and feeling the weight of what I'd forgotten. It wasn't just nostalgia. It was something sharper, like seeing a roadmap of a life I'd veered away from. The notebook was filled with ideas I'd never followed through on, songs I'd never written, places I'd planned to visit but never did. I didn't feel regret, exactly. More like possibility. I went back to the building the next day, but it was gone. The red door, the warped wood, the plaque. It had all disappeared. In its place was a blank brick wall, the kind that looks like it's been there forever. I stood there for a long time, half expecting the door to reappear, but it never did. I still have the shoebox, though. It sits on my desk, a quiet reminder that not everything we lose is gone forever. Some things are just waiting to be found. So, what about you? If there were a place where you could find something you'd lost, Something you didn't even realize you missed. What would you hope to see? What would you take back? There's a door at the end of my grandmother's hallway. It doesn't lead anywhere. The house itself is old, the kind of old that makes floors creak under carpets and whispers float up from the pipes. It's always smelled like mothballs and dried herbs, with sunlight spilling through the windows in fractured patterns, like it's been diluted by the glass. But that door, has always been different. It's smaller than a regular door, about 5 feet tall, with a rounded top like something out of a storybook. The wood is blackened, almost charred, and the surface is carved with faint symbols that no one in the family can decipher. My grandmother calls it the still door. She's never explained why. When I was little, I wasn't allowed near it. My grandmother was strict about that. The hallway is fine, she'd say, her voice sharp but not angry. But don't touch the door. Why not? I asked her once. She set down her teacup with a deliberate clink. Because it doesn't belong to us. That answer didn't make sense when I was 7. Honestly, it doesn't make much more sense now. The door has no handle, no visible hinges. It doesn't budge if you push it, though I've only tried a few times. Always when I was alone. Always with a quick glance over my shoulder to make sure my grandmother wasn't watching. There's no lock, but I swear, the wood feels warm under your fingertips, like it's been left in the sun too long. When I was 12, I made the mistake of asking my uncle about it. He'd been drinking wine, his laughter loose and sloppy, and I thought maybe he'd finally tell me what made the door so strange. He chuckled at first, ruffling my hair like I was still a little kid. "Ah, the still door," he said, his voice dropping into an exaggerated stage whisper. "That's where Grandma keeps her secrets. The big ones." "What secrets?" I pressed, my heart pounding. He looked at me then, his eyes going sharp and sober in an instant, and the sudden seriousness in his face made my stomach twist. "Don't ask," he said quietly, "and don't go near it. Not unless you're ready to lose something." I didn't know what he meant by that. I still don't. But after that night, I stopped asking questions. The thing about the door is that it doesn't make itself obvious. It doesn't creak or groan. It doesn't glow or whisper your name. Most of the time, it just is, sitting there at the end of the hallway, quietly absorbing dust and years. But there are moments, rare, fleeting moments, when it feels different. Once, when I was 16, I passed it late at night on my way to the kitchen. The house was silent, the kind of silence that presses against your eardrums, and I swear I heard breathing, soft and slow, coming from the other side of the door. I froze, my foot hovering above the carpet, and for a moment, I thought I saw the symbols carved into the wood shift, like they were rearranging themselves. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for something, anything, to happen, but nothing did. The next morning, the door looked the same as always. The older I got, the more I convinced myself it was just a trick of the mind, a quirk of living in an old house filled with shadows and strange angles. But there was always a sliver of doubt, a tiny, gnawing part of me that couldn't quite let it go. Last year, my grandmother fell ill. She was 87, still sharp as a blade most days, but her body had started to betray her. She refused to leave the house, even when the doctors suggested moving her to a care facility. "This is my home," she said, her voice firm despite the tremor in her hands. "I'll leave it when I'm ready." I started visiting more often after that, helping with groceries, cleaning, sitting with her in the afternoons while she knitted or read. And every time I walked down that hallway, every time I passed the still door, I felt it watching me. One evening, as I was helping her into bed, she grabbed my wrist with surprising strength. Her eyes, pale and cloudy now, locked onto mine. "If you hear it knock," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, "don't answer." My throat went dry. "What do you mean?" She didn't reply. She just released my wrist and turned her face to the wall, as if the conversation had never happened. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay on the couch in the living room, staring at the ceiling, listening to the house settle and shift. Around 2 a.m., I heard it. A knock. It wasn't loud, just a soft, deliberate tap-tap-tap, like someone gently testing the surface of the door with their knuckles. My heart stopped. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined it. But then it came again, louder this time. Tap, tap, tap. I sat up, every muscle in my body tense. The hallway was dark, but the door was visible, its outline faintly illuminated by the moonlight streaming through the windows. It didn't move, but I could feel the air around it shift, like the pressure had changed. I should have stayed on the couch. I should have ignored it. But something pulled me forward, something I can't explain. My bare feet made no sound on the carpet as I approached. The door looked the same as always, small, blackened, carved with those strange symbols. But now, there was a faint glow emanating from the cracks in the wood, a soft, pulsing light that reminded me of fireflies. I raised my hand, hesitating for just a moment, and placed my palm against the door. It was warm, warmer than it should have been, almost hot. And then, just as quickly as it started, the knocking stopped. The glow faded. The air returned to normal. The house was silent again, as if nothing had happened. I stood there for a long time, my hand still pressed to the wood, waiting for something to change. But the door stayed closed. The next morning, my grandmother passed away in her sleep. I don't know if the two things are connected. I don't know if I want to know. The house is mine now, though I can't bring myself to live in it. I visit sometimes, to check on things, to keep it from falling apart. The still door is still there, unchanged, waiting at the end of the hallway. I don't go near it anymore. But sometimes, when the nights are quiet and the air feels heavy, I think I can hear it. Tap, tap, tap. The first thing I noticed was the quiet. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that buzzes just beneath your skin, reminding you of how loud the world usually is. I was used to background noise, the hum of the city, the distant thrum of a plane, the faint murmur of conversations filtering through walls. But here, in this nowhere town I'd driven into by accident, the quiet had weight. I hadn't meant to stop. My plan was to keep driving, let the miles carry me far enough that the problems I'd left behind would lose their grip. But the gas gauge had dipped below E, and this place, marked only by a fading sign that said, "Welcome to Azimuth," was the first spot I'd seen in hours. The gas station was the kind of relic you only see in old movies. A single pump, paint peeling from the sign, a small convenience store with dusty windows. There was no one at the counter when I stepped inside. Just rows of shelves filled with items that looked like they'd been sitting there for decades. Cans with faded labels, glass bottles of soda and flavors I'd never heard of. A rack of maps, so old they still listed territories that didn't exist anymore. "Help you?" The voice startled me. An old man had appeared behind the counter, seemingly out of nowhere. His eyes were sharp, too sharp, and his smile didn't quite reach them. "Just need to fill up," I said, fishing a crumpled bill from my pocket. He didn't move, just stared at me for a moment, as if weighing something. "You're passing through?" "That's the plan," I said, trying to sound casual. He nodded, slowly. "You should be quick about it. Sunset's early here." I almost laughed, like I needed a warning about nighttime. But his tone wasn't joking. It carried an edge, something unspoken but unmistakable. Outside, the air felt thicker, the quiet more oppressive. I filled the tank, glancing nervously at the sky, which had already taken on the deep purple of dusk. The old man's words lingered in my head, though I told myself they were just small-town eccentricities. As I turned back toward my car, I saw her. She was sitting on the curb near the edge of the lot, her back to me, her long hair hanging like a curtain. She wasn't there before. I was sure of it. "Hey," I called out, unsure why I felt compelled to speak. "You okay?" She didn't answer, didn't move. I hesitated, then walked toward her, my footsteps crunching on the gravel. "Miss, do you?" She turned before I could finish, and the words froze in my throat. Her face was wrong, not scarred or disfigured, but arranged in a way that made no sense. Her eyes were too far apart, her mouth too wide, her features shifting slightly as if they couldn't decide where to settle. She didn't blink, just stared at me with a gaze that felt more like a wait than a look. "Do you know where you're going?" she asked, her voice too soft, almost like a whisper. Yeah," I lied, taking a step back. "I'm just passing through." She tilted her head, her movements unnaturally slow. "No one just passes through Azimuth." Before I could respond, The sound of a bell rang out from the gas station. I turned instinctively, and when I looked back, she was gone. The spot where she'd been sitting was empty, the gravel undisturbed. I didn't wait to figure out what had just happened. I jumped into my car and started the engine, the tires spinning slightly on the loose ground as I pulled out of the lot. The road out of town was straight and narrow, flanked by fields that stretched into the darkness. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see her face staring back at me. But the road stayed empty, the town receding into the distance. Then the headlights flickered. I gripped the wheel tighter, my pulse quickening. "Not now," I muttered, as if the car might listen. The lights dimmed, flared back to life, then went out completely, leaving me in pitch blackness. The engine died next, the car rolling to a stop as the silence swallowed me whole. I sat there, breathing hard, the weight of the quiet pressing against my ears. That's when I saw them. Figures, dozens of them, emerging from the fields on either side of the road. Their movements were slow and deliberate, their shapes just barely visible in the faint glow of the moon. They didn't look at me, didn't make a sound, just walked, their heads tilted slightly downward as if following an unseen path. I locked the doors, my fingers fumbling with the button. My heart pounded as I watched them approach, their forms growing clearer with each step. Their faces were like hers, shifting, unstable, impossible. One of them stopped near the hood of the car, its head turning slowly to face me. Its eyes glowed faintly, and its mouth stretched into a shape that might have been a smile but wasn't. The others stopped too, standing in eerie, perfect silence. And then, in unison, they spoke. "You're here now." The words weren't loud, but they filled the air, vibrating through my chest. I couldn't move, couldn't think. I wanted to scream, but the sound caught in my throat. The figures began to circle the car, their movements fluid and synchronized. The quiet deepened, swallowing even the sound of my ragged breathing. Then everything went dark. The summer I got fired from my first real job, I spent most of my mornings sitting in the park, drinking coffee I couldn't afford and feeding squirrels with whatever snacks I could scrounge from the back of my pantry. It wasn't exactly the life I'd envisioned for myself post-college, but after a series of questionable decisions and one particularly bad day involving an exploding copy machine, I'd found myself unemployed, broke, and deeply unsure of what the hell I was supposed to do next. The squirrels weren't picky. They took stale granola bars, leftover bread crusts, even a half-melted protein bar I'd forgotten about in my car. They darted around my bench like tiny, jittery freeloaders, pausing just long enough to snatch whatever I offered before scampering away. I liked watching them. They were efficient, fearless, and entirely unbothered by my existential crisis. On one particularly sticky August morning, I was halfway through my second cup of coffee when I noticed a guy sitting on the bench across from me. He had a sketch pad balanced on his knees and a pencil tucked behind his ear, and he was staring at the squirrels with a kind of intense focus that made me wonder if he was plotting to overthrow their tiny squirrel society. He looked about my age, maybe a little older, with dark hair that stuck out in every direction and a faded band t-shirt that probably predated both of us. I didn't mean to stare, but I was bored, and he was weird, and weird people are inherently interesting. He must have felt my gaze, because he suddenly looked up and said, "Do you think they have names?" "Who?" I asked, startled. "The squirrels," he said, gesturing at the little group gathered around my feet. "Do you think they name each other? Or is that just a human thing?" I blinked at him. "I don't know. I've never really thought about it." He nodded, like my answer was deeply profound. "I think they do. It's probably something simple, like nut or leaf. Something functional." "Functional names make sense," I said slowly, because I wasn't sure what else to say. He grinned, and I realized he had the kind of smile that could disarm even the most awkward of situations. "I'm Theo, by the way. Not a functional name, but it works." "Ellie," I said. "Nice to meet you." After that, Theo started showing up at the park almost every morning. At first, we just exchanged nods or small talk, but eventually, he started sitting on my bench instead of his, and we'd spend hours talking about the most random things. He told me he was a freelance illustrator, which explained the sketchpad, and that he came to the park for creative inspiration, though he admitted he mostly just ended up drawing squirrels. "Look at this one," he said one morning, holding up his sketchpad to show me a surprisingly detailed pencil drawing of a squirrel wearing a tiny wizard hat. "I'm thinking of calling it the Nutmeg. What do you think?" "I think you've officially spent too much time with squirrels," I said, but I couldn't help smiling. As the weeks went on, I started looking forward to our conversations more than I cared to admit. Theo was one of those people who could make even the most mundane topics feel fascinating. He'd ask questions like, "If you could time travel, but only to one specific year, which year would you choose?" Or, "Do you think dogs think we're bad hunters because we come home with groceries instead of fresh kills?" He had a way of seeing the world that made everything feel lighter, less suffocating. One morning, he handed me a small, folded piece of paper without explanation. I opened it to find a drawing of me sitting on the bench, surrounded by squirrels. In the sketch, I looked calm, almost content, which felt wildly inaccurate but oddly comforting. "I thought you could use some perspective," he said with a shrug, as if that explained everything. For the first time in months, I felt like I might actually be okay. But then, as suddenly as he'd appeared, Theo stopped showing up. I waited at the park every morning for a week, then 2, but there was no sign of him. I didn't know his last name or where he lived, so there wasn't much I could do except wonder if I'd somehow imagined the whole thing. On the 10th morning, I found another folded piece of paper tucked under a rock on the bench. Inside was a sketch of a squirrel holding a tiny sign that said, "You're going to be okay." There was no signature, no explanation, just that simple message. I never saw Theo again, but I still have that drawing. It sits on my desk, a reminder that even the smallest, strangest connections can leave a mark. So, now I'm curious. Have you ever crossed paths with someone who completely changed your perspective, even if only for a little while? Someone who showed up out of nowhere and made your life better, just by being in it? I'd love to hear your story.